All right, folks. It's about 9:03. We'll get this meeting started. We're going to start with a couple introductory remarks from Aaron Sandine and Michael Sherman. Aaron is Deputy Director of ADOA, the State CIO, and the Chair of the Public Safety Communications Advisory Commission. So he wears a lot of hats around.
I do. We joke about titles. So good morning. I'm Aaron Sandine. Morning to those on the phone as well. Mike told me I had 10 seconds. So I think most of it was wasted on my title. Exactly. So thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it. We know this is a really long journey, and this is really the beginning. This is absolutely critical. You know, Tom and I were just talking about cloud. I think this is kind of that beginning of a conversation from a public safety perspective as well, and I think that's some of the stuff that'll eventually be seen from this as this comes to fruition. But there's a long haul between here and there. So with that, I'm going to get out of the way. Thank you all very much. Have a great time.
Okay, and now we have Michael Sherman, who's the Executive Director of the
Broadband Planning and Public Safety Communications Group, which is laughing on Mike. We're joking about whose title is longer, but this is actually a kind of a new group within ADOA Asset that brought together broadband planning work that ADOA had undertaken for the state of Arizona, 911 administration, the public safety interoperability work, and management of our obligations under the FirstNet grant for FirstNet. So really interesting work. And I just want to thank some of you that and your agencies. Tom, thanks for the support, and Lisa for this work and helping put on this event today, because ultimately the success of a broadband data network and FirstNet gets down to the coverage. They talk about what devices, what business models, you know, pricing and all that, but if we're not well prepared for planning the right coverage for the state of Arizona, the network will not be successful. So really would encourage feedback today so that we can move forward with this important planning work. So thank you.
Thanks. Okay. And now we're going to hand it over to Brian Hobson, who's with SPAWAR out of San Diego. They're running the coverage workshops nationally. How many have you done, Brian?
This will probably be like 26, 27.
Okay, so right in the middle, the sweet spot.
That's right.
Okay. It's new enough to be vibrant and yet not stale. All right, thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Welcome, and thank you for attending. So as Mike said, I'm Brian Hobson with support to the Office of Emergency Communications. We've been doing these workshops across the country, just trying to help states prepare as much as possible before the consultation starts with FirstNet. So there's a lot of activity that will be going on, that will be phased through this process. So really the goal of this workshop is to kind of focus in on those key areas that will be important early on in this process. So we kind of have the day broken into the three groups here. We have, we'll start off with a one-on-one overview. I know that might be a review for a lot of you. So it's sometimes a good opportunity if there's questions that might trigger some things that even if you have seen it a few times, you have a few questions. So I'll try to go through that pretty quickly. And then the second part of the next two parts of the day, or the morning, will focus kind of on these key initiatives that we're trying to help states get prepared for, or start getting you thinking about how you're going to go about gathering this information on coverage. Where do you need coverage in the state? What level of coverage? So we'll talk a lot about that. And some maps and some information that we've compiled for you to kind of just help begin that process. And then we'll talk about users. Where do you have users? How many users do you have? The importance of users for the design aspects of the network, so that you get a grasp on a handle on that. We'll go through some basics, and hopefully that you have some understanding of the importance of those different things, what will be expected of you, and that will help you prepare. Because as I mentioned, this will be something that FirstNet will be looking for the states from very early in the process. So again, having done this several times, one of the feedbacks we've got is this is acronym soup. There's a lot of new acronyms, so we stuck this slide here up right at the beginning. So if there's Acronyms you're not familiar with, don't recognize, this is a good place to refer back to figure out what that meant. All right, so a little background on us. The Office of Emergency Communications within Department of Homeland Security really is focused on supporting states, territories, and federal agencies on interoperable communications. There's several groups or several branches within the office. I myself work in support of the Technical Assistance Branch, so that's why we're here providing free technical assistance to states and territories. That's kind of how it works. I'll talk a little bit about some of the things we do. We have in the back there Tom Lawless, who's also a part of OEC. Tom, you want to just do a brief introduction?
Good morning, some of you I know. I'm the regional coordinator for Region 9, the Office of Emergency Communications. I've been on board for about 4 years. Last year, I didn't get to play with you guys too much. I talked to Aaron earlier. It's kind of broken a lot last year. Decided to bring me back, fun stuff like that. After 4 years, you guys appreciate this, working with different agencies. After 4 years, I finally got my gut vehicle, so I can actually drive out here. Eventually drive like this line here, just over to San Diego. Broadband is obviously, one thing that OEC is really working with you guys to kind of figure out how that's going to work for you and working with FirstNet folks. And also, too, obviously, we do a lot more broadband. We do a lot of LMR stuff. Already have a lot of side conversations with folks about the Super Bowl and how making stuff work and/or not fail during that. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
So Tom is responsible for the region and is from a different branch within OEC, but so there's a lot of activities that go on. We're just specifically here supporting technical assistance. The way technical assistance works is kind of a three-pronged approach. We provide state-requested technical assistance every year. Every state can request up to 5 requests, this being one of them. We also have national priority offerings, so if there's a push initiative or something that the office really wants to focus on because it's a hot topic, for example, in the states. Broadband being one of the push initiatives for this year, this past year. That's one we focus on as well. And then we also have a website, publicsafetytools.info. You may be familiar with it, may not. There's a lot of tools and resources there. That's a good way, too, that for things that we develop or tools that we develop, it's a good way to push and make those available to stakeholders beyond what we can do with these engagements on one-on-one. This is just a really quick snapshot. You can see that we typically do around 150 to 200 of these engagements a year in a wide variety of offerings. Broadband being the #1 requested one, not too surprisingly. This is the website that I mentioned, so publicsafetytools.info is kind of broken into 3 categories: tools, resources, and training. So there's a lot of good information there if you have time to check it out. And I know Arizona is a big user, and so if whatever you guys want to talk about that at a break, whatever, I'm sure we'd welcome the input. Quick snapshot of where we've gone and where we're going. It's a little bit out of date, but you can see a lot of states we've completed. For some reason, we wound up picking the northern part of the states that hit in the winter, which wasn't the best. But anyway, we've done a lot of these, so we've got a lot of good feedback, seeing where a lot of states are. So I know you guys work very well with the western states and just your region, but we have worked across the country. So if there's ever questions you have on what people are doing, how they're doing it, always feel free to reach out. We can probably point you to someone that has tackled it or facing the same challenges. All right, so really quickly to kind of introduce broadband and what this is, because sometimes there still is some confusion on what exactly it's going to do and what exactly it's not going to do. So as we know today, users have their LMR radios that are used specifically for man mobile radio and mission-critical voice in particular. And then there's other resources available, sometimes carrying smartphones or cell phones to make voice calls over the commercial networks. And then also, a lot of the commercial applications or services used are done over commercial networks. Not always. I know there's some private networks, but quite a bit are done over existing commercial networks. The problem, as we know, is that anytime there's storms or congestion or just a lack of coverage because that's not where public safety operates, you have all those limitations on the commercial network because they're just not designed for typical public safety operations. and it's a come one, come all, everyone's equal on the network, so there's no prioritization for public safety. So really the goal for this initial build-out of the nationwide network is to make these connections to those same applications mission critical. So that same resiliency, redundancy, reliability that you have on your LMR networks today, to replicate that so you're making, so now all of the services and tools that public safety has are mission critical. Now notice that that does not mean that the voice networks will be mission critical just yet, because as we will see and we'll go through, that connection, that service isn't going to be rolled out potentially in the initial build-out. This network will be primarily focused on mission-critical data and making sure you have access to those data applications. Now, eventually, the long-term vision or goal is to get to the point where you could be leveraging both voice and data over this network. So now you've got the ability to access what you need on this existing network, but knowing that you can still continue to use those land mobile radio networks for mission-critical voice. Because we know that there's going to be, there's so much trust invested in those networks and so much investment that's going to be a long time before public safety is willing to migrate off of those networks and fully trust a new network to perform their service. And if there's any questions, please, by all means, feel free to jump in, raise your hand. So this is just another way that we've put together a graphic to try to capture some of that. So you can see here we've got mission-critical voice being used today. There's some, obviously limited low-speed data that's supported on that as well. The continued use or use today of commercial and unlicensed data. And we're going to introduce this new nationwide public safety broadband network in parallel to these other networks. It's not like it's going to replace any of these networks. It's going to be introduced in parallel. And to get to that long-term vision that people see for this, or really desire to get everyone moved onto a single nationwide network providing voice and data services, there are many, many, many challenges to get there. And there's no time frame for this to get there either. So you can see that this is, before we ever get to that long-term vision, there's many things to be conquered. And that's just to try to reiterate. I know there's some confusion. I think some of it's been limited over the last year or two, but there's still some confusion sometimes on, well, when this network goes up, it's going to support voice, because they liken it to cell phones, but it's not mission critical. What do I do with my LMR radios? So we're just trying to make sure everyone's clear that LMR is not going away. It's a long time before you get to this converged network. There's a lot of challenges that will be faced. So that solution for this network is, there's many goals, many high-level goals for the reason why they wanted to create a nationwide network. To have a next-generation advanced network of technology from a public safety to provide these high data rates that are being leveraged in the sector for different applications, to use industry standards as much as possible while not sacrificing public safety unique requirements, for a lot of benefits there, for interoperability. You also, with using commercial technology, get big economies of scale. And then also just being able to leverage, whatever commercial advancements go into the technology from the consumer. Since this technology's long-term evolution, LTE is a technology that is being adopted globally. So there's a lot of investment from the commercial sector going into it. So the challenges we mentioned, one of the huge challenges for this is just getting spectrum. If you're going to build out a nationwide network, you need spectrum. And that was accomplished with the passing of the law. You need funding. And that has been allocated, not necessarily received, but been allocated for the build out of this network. But there's other issues we've talked about, governance, policy, how are you going to do this? This is really a new paradigm for public safety in the states and working and building out some nationwide networks, but still having the autonomy that's necessary within each of the states. All right, so a little background on some of the technology. So long-term evolution is the standard that was chosen for this network. It's considered to be one of the 4G technologies that you'll see advertised in the commercials. It's a standard that they kind of changed the way they approach the development of the standard. So a lot of the previous standards had been built upon earlier standards. And the commercial network, it started out where phone calls or voice calls dominated the use of of these networks. Well, they've recognized that today, very few of us are using our phones to actually make phone calls. We're using it to browse that web and check email and text and do a lot more data functions. So when they developed this standard, they really designed it to support data first, with voice kind of as a secondary afterthought. And consequently, that's still being worked. So today, LTE networks, on your phone today, you're not making voice calls over the LTE network. When you pick up your LTE-capable phone, you're making a phone call over the legacy networks because it's not currently supported on the major carrier networks today. So if you do make a phone call, it's either on the legacy network or it could be some type of voice over IP application, but it's not over the LTE network inherently. The backbone is an all-IP backbone, so that was a big change from some of the legacy systems that required fixed lines or leased lines or dedicated circuits for connectivity. Huge economies of scale potential because of the adoption of this technology globally. Mobility, interoperability, all those things for roaming from network to network or connecting different networks are all built into the standard. Flexible channel bandwidths, which are important as spectrum could potentially be allocated, or more spectrum could be allocated. This technology supports it. High data rates I mentioned. Security, authentication, priority and quality of service. Those are all really critical aspects for the build-out of a public safety network, and those are all built into the standard. It's just a matter of how they get implemented and rolled out in the deployment of a network. And then there's some new antenna techniques that really kind of help improve the performance of the system for trying to overcome some of those shortcomings of a low-power, small form factor devices. So a little bit on the basic building blocks. As if you haven't already heard, there will be some new terminology that you'll hear with respect to this system and this technology. This is a chart that actually FirstNet had put together and used to kind of inform some users in previous meetings. So they kind of broke it into 4 different categories. So you start with the core, which it's really the evolved packet core, or EPC. That it usually just gets referred to as the core. The core, you can kind of compare it to a trunk system, LMR system. It's the key, databases, servers, infrastructure piece of the network. And so it has all of the applications, the provisioning, the user management. It's really the, kind of controls the network. And those can be very high capacity things where, for example, the big carriers may only have 5, 6 of those supporting their whole nationwide network. So it's not like what we're more used to with some trunk systems where maybe you've got several cores to support a region or statewide system. These can support big wide area systems. It also means that they've got, with the capacity that they have, they can support, there's a lot of fallback capability where if one goes down, they can kind of recover for the other. An important building block in this that's much more important, I think, than previous networks is just the transport layer or the backhaul layer. This network requires a significant amount of bandwidth to deliver those high-end data rates to the end user. That requires a lot of aggregation and backhaul. So some existing sites or networks today that support existing voice networks may not necessarily support this type of network because the backhaul requirements are so much more. So that's an important aspect of the network. And then you have the radio access network, or the RAN. So that is the compilation of all the base stations, basically, that are built out, all the tower sites for the network. And that connects through the transport into the core. And the important distinction between the RAN and the core is that when you start working with FirstNet to build out this network, FirstNet's responsibility ultimately is the core. No matter what, they will be building out the core that every state RAN connects into to provide this nationwide network. The RAN will be one of the primary responsibilities in working with FirstNet that the states have to give a lot of input on where you want that RAN, what will that build out look like, because that's what drives coverage. So that's what we'll talk a lot more about today. So that's the important distinction between the RAN and the core. And then finally, the kind of the last building block is the device side, the end user side. Subscriber units or portable mobile radios. In this terminology, a lot of times it might refer to as UE or devices, user equipment. Some different terminology. So with LTE, you'll hear core, RAN, and UE or devices, equivalent to what you're familiar with on the LMR side. So this is the kind of layout of the spectrum. So similar to LMR and VHF and UHF and 700, 800, there's similarities as well with the commercial environment. So they call their spectrum grouping band classes or bands. So public safety has dedicated spectrum in what's called band 14, you can see here. So Verizon's band 13, AT&T's band 17. A lot of the commercial carriers have spectrum outside 700 megahertz. This is just kind of a snapshot of 700 megahertz because this is where the public safety spectrum resides. So early on when the spectrum was allocated and they were looking at different ways to build out this network, they had kind of allocated some spectrum right here for public safety in the blue. And then they had this D block that they were going to do, that public-private partnership. And that failed to go through. The option wasn't met. And they kind of were stuck trying to figure out, well, what do we do with the spectrum now to try to ultimately achieve this goal of building out a public safety broadband network? So when the legislation was passed, that we'll talk a little bit about, it allocated that spectrum to public safety. So now band 14 is dedicated, allocated for the build-out of this broadband network. You can see it's 20 megahertz total, 10 megahertz on the uplink, and 10 megahertz on the downlink. So 20 megahertz total. So sometimes you'll hear it 10 by 10 or 20 megahertz or 10 megahertz, but it's broken down. It's different than the 700 megahertz allocation for LMR. So, so any of the LMR systems that might be using 700 megahertz channels for their voice networks, those are a different chunk of spectrum, and that's all allocated to public safety. You'll see too that the amount of spectrum allocated is actually pretty comparable to, like, for example, what Verizon has, just adjacent. So they're building out their nationwide network for LTE on an 11 by 11 piece of spectrum. They have other spectrum in different bands where some of their legacy networks operate. This is specific to their LTE network. And they're looking to acquire more spectrum. But so public safety does have quite a bit of spectrum compared to the commercial carriers for the build-out of this network. And these band classes are important because that's what separates your phone from being able to operate on different networks. So, for example, if you just take your Verizon phone, just because it does LTE, operates at 700 megahertz, doesn't mean it'll be able to operate necessarily on the public safety network, because it's going to be dedicated to operate on band 13 and maybe a couple other bands in different parts of the frequency band. So as phones come out, they may very likely support multiple of these band classes. They do today, but there might be ones that will support the public safety band. But it's not just kind of a come one, come all. If you do LTE, you do 700 megahertz, you can operate in the public safety band. So we talked a little bit about voice and the fact that mission-critical voice is desired to ultimately run on this network, but will be quite a while. And it quickly became apparent that there wasn't really a recognized definition of what it meant for public safety voice, mission-critical voice. So NIPSIC, the National Public Safety Telecommunications Council, made a group, I think, Michael, you may have participated on that group, developed a white paper that helped define what is mission-critical voice. What does that mean? And they came up with basically these 7 kind of high-level functions, and those are they're defined, in more detail in this paper. But those were good areas of what really defined mission-critical voice. And some of the key ones that are really unique are definitely push-to-talk voice. So you don't typically have that on cellular networks today. There can be some, the Nextel network that did specialize in it, but in most networks are not doing push-to-talk voice. Direct mode or talk-around is a huge one. Today in commercial networks, your phones always have to go through the infrastructure, talking to base stations. There's no device-to-device communications over the LTE network. You can do it over Wi-Fi or other technologies, but not over LTE. So that's a big one that is required in the LMR networks and the way public safety user radios today that's not supported by this technology. Emergency alerting is also a big one, being able to make emergency calls or notify people of an emergency. So this was a really good definition to help if this network is eventually going to support public safety and their mission-critical voice requirements, it needs to meet these things. You can download it at the website here, and this definition is being helped to drive the standards development now in the standards bodies to start addressing some of these needs. So, for example, just recently, push-to-talk was accepted in the standards committee, so that's now being worked into the standards for LTE, and as well as they call it proximity services. So basically, the ability to support this direct talk around mode. So that's also being worked in the standard. So it's a really good thing. This is, it's different because this is a global standard and it's primarily driven by industry. Now, public safety having a role in this is a little bit different than they've had in the past when they had complete control over, for example, like the Project 25 standards, P25, where they drove the development because public safety was the primary user of those standards. So, trying to break down voice a little bit and clarifying why you might hear voices can be done over LTE or no, it can't. So today, there's no reason that because it's a data network that you can't run voice over IP. So Skype or Google Talk or any of those type of voice over IP applications can absolutely be done over the network because they just look like to the network another data application. The commercial carriers are just carrying out this a standard for LTE to support voice, so they can start to migrate their users onto the LTE network and support voice and get people off some of their old legacy networks and recover some of that spectrum and some of that backhaul infrastructure. So the standard that's going to support voice, so you start making a voice call over your phone, is called VoLTE, or Voice over LTE. And that, it looks like a lot of the carriers are targeting releasing that this year, sometime this calendar year. There are some push-to-talk solutions that exist today over LTE. There's nothing that's standardized yet, and I think they're kind of coined non-mission critical because they don't meet some of those requirements identified by the NIPSIC requirement, primarily the latency. Low latency is required for public safety operations, and some of these push-to-talk solutions don't meet those latency requirements. So there is no push-to-talk requirement that supports mission-critical operations, nor is there a direct mode on this network, like I've said. And so that's why when you start hearing voice and what voice can be implemented over LTE, it's kind of important to know, well, what are you talking about? Are you talking push-to-talk, non-push-to-talk, low latency, non-low latency, the voice over IP? What type of voice you're talking about? Because if you want to support public safety, you have to be down here, and what's being worked on right now is up here. Any questions so far? All right. So I mentioned the standards body developing LTE. This is it's a global standards body. Standards group has worked all the way back to the GSM days, so it's a proven standards body. They've got a roadmap for the future, so they've already started in on LTE advanced, even though the networks today are deploying LTE. So they're continuing to work at developing these standards, which is great for LTE because it means that these networks are being built, especially network, that there's a roadmap for the future for this technology, and it's not going to be abandoned in lieu of something else. All the carriers today are deploying this technology and focused on solely this technology. It's the first time all the major carriers in the country have deployed the same technology with their networks. So that's a great thing for the future of this technology. I mentioned a little bit the standards body. That's developing this, so it is a commercial entity. However, FirstNet has actually worked with a group out of Boulder, the Public Safety Communications Research Group, and have tasked them to help participate in these standard development meetings to kind of be the voice for public safety in FirstNet. So they've done a great job of partnering not only with a group within that organization, but also kind of there's been a lot of momentum build up globally. Building a strong voice for public safety, which has helped really prioritize some of those public safety requirements in the development of these standards. So as these standards evolve, it's anticipated that they'll be able to support some of those public safety unique requirements that aren't supported on those networks today, like push-to-talk, like direct mode. So that's a big step, because when this work first started, there was a difficulty in getting traction within that group because they just weren't prioritized. Public safety requirements weren't prioritized in that group. And they are today, so that's a big change. All right, any questions kind of on the technology background? You guys are pros. All right, so let's talk a little bit about FirstNet. So the creation of FirstNet occurred with the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act. You've probably heard that a dozen times now. Really quickly, what it did in the creation of that bill. The main thing is that public safety had lobbied to try to build out this network for years. And so it was finally the success of public safety coming together with a single voice and getting a network started for public safety. So it awarded that D block of spectrum that I showed on that spectrum chart. So that chunk of spectrum that was kind of just held there, trying to figure out what to do with it, was awarded to public safety, dedicated to them. It created FirstNet, the First Responder Network, which is an independent authority under NTA and Department of Commerce as the responsible entity for building and managing this network. It required a nationwide approach for the build out of this network, and in doing that, the license for the spectrum nationwide was given to FirstNet, so they managed the spectrum for the build of the network. It funded a total of, it allocated $7 billion of funding for this network, $2 billion of which were kind of given up front as a loan to get started on the activity as well. More spectrum is auctioned off to generate revenue to eventually fully fund that $7 billion. It allocated separately $135 million into a grant program, the State and Local Implementation Grant Program, or commonly referred to as SLICP. So that's the grant that is helping the states do these planning activities. And it also specified an opt-in or opt-out provision, which we'll talk a bit more in detail, so that that the states have the ability to accept the FirstNet plan or opt out and develop their own plan. Quick chart of the funding, just to show how this looks like. So, as I mentioned, $7 billion total. $2 billion is given up front to help start kind of these planning activities that we're in now. Eventually, that same $7 billion and a big part of that $2 billion will be used for the implementation and the build-out of that network. And once that $7 billion is gone in the build-out of this network, it's required by law to be a self-sustaining network. So the business model has to make sure that whatever is built out, that it's going to be self-sustaining into the future. So there are several ways that were identified in the law of how that can be done. So first and foremost, there's going to be, like the user fees, just like you pay today with commercial services. So some type of user fee to use or access the network. You've also may have heard that the spectrum that they have is a very hot commodity. It's a very valued piece of spectrum. And so the public safety network with the limited users of public safety may not potentially use all that capacity on the network, certainly maybe not during day-to-day activities. So they're looking at ways that they can lease out some of that excess spectrum and generate more revenue from that as well to maybe some of the commercial carriers that could use some of that spectrum for the build-out of their networks. And then finally, just the lease of any network, equipment, sites, backhaul that is built out by FirstNet, they can lease that out as well. So those are all different ways that the network can generate revenue for sustainment and continued development of the network. This was FirstNet's approved budget for FY14, approved by the board in August. And really what it does is it shows kind of where the focus areas are for this upcoming year. You can see it's a total of $194 million, so quite a bit of funding that was allocated or approved. Some of the biggest areas you can see right through the middle here are state consultation and the development of these network plans, state network plans. So this consultation process is going to drive ultimately the development of these network plans. And you can see that's a big area of the funding for FirstNet, what they're focused on. They're starting on the core network. As I mentioned, it's FirstNet's responsibility to develop the core, no matter if states opt in or opt out. They have significant investment getting started. There's some early mover projects you may have, like the LA RICS or the Adams County, Harris County. Some of those early builders or early movers, areas that were building out projects with some grant money that they had gotten, and so they're working with them to gain access to the spectrum, since FirstNet is now the license holder, and then figure out how those can kind of be good lessons learned and integrate into the network later on. And then obviously there's some investment in devices today, and then just building up the company, making sure they're standing up an organization to be basically the 5th largest nationwide carrier in the country. So that takes a fair amount of work to do as well. Responsibilities of FirstNet per the law. So this is important because this is what FirstNet must do as prescribed by the law. It doesn't mean that FirstNet's not going to do many other things in this process, but these are definitely ones that have to be addressed in the law. So they have to do state consultation and work with the states to develop what those state plans will be. And frankly, that's the desire, because you as the potential users, they want to know what the state's needs are to build out those state plans. They'll be responsible for management of the network, so everything from the contracts and building up the program office. Standards, so that's why they've already teamed with the PSCR, Public Safety Communications Research Group, and ensuring that public safety has a voice in those standards, and also that standards are met for the build of this network, that they're following whatever release or the current release of standards are. Certified equipment list, any device that goes onto this network must be certified, and FirstNet will define what that certification process looks like, but it won't just be any device can just get on the network without going through some type of certification process. Generating RFPs for the network, that process has already started. They've released and received feedback on several RFIs, so in the very early stages of that. Commercial infrastructure, so there's a responsibility here for FirstNet to build this network out as efficiently as possible, so leveraging any existing infrastructure, whether it's state, local, federal, tribal, private, commercial, they're going to look at all possible ways to build up this network as effectively and cost-effectively as possible. Cybersecurity is a big one. That's, obviously there's some unique requirements for public safety on our networks and making sure the networks are secure, so that's been a big focus area. Integrating PSAPs, and rural is a big one too that's unique, where the law wanted to make sure that the network was going to serve both big city areas but also rural. So they need to develop some rural milestones of how they plan to roll out this network to support the rural communities, not just the major cities. And you notice the one thing the law says that they cannot do is they cannot sell directly to consumers. So this network, it will be to support public safety users, not to just the general public. So FirstNet stood up a board of directors. The board of directors is a board of 15 people. The first 3 are permanent members. You can see at the top here the Secretary of DHS, Attorney General, and the Director of OMB. The remaining 12 are appointed by NTIA, and they have to have minimally 3 public safety professionals on the board and at least 3 representatives representing state, local, and tribal. And they want a diverse background of whether it's technical, financial, or business side of it. So you can see here's the board. They do have 4 public safety members representing the major 3 disciplines, and you can see there's quite a few others that have come from a wide variety of backgrounds. A very diverse board. I think it's been very effective at of blending the commercial and the public safety groups together so far. The program office is being set up in FirstNet, so Bill DiAgostino is the general manager, appointed last summer. The deputy general manager is T.J. Kennedy, and so you probably have seen Bill and T.J.'s name mentioned several times. They're still building out the rest of the team here. Several of these positions actually have been filled here in the program office, and then they're also hiring out positions underneath with each one of these. And you can kind of see what the different responsibilities would be within each of the branches of the office. So FirstNet is going to organize very similar to how FEMA and DHS organize today. We're going to group by, just for kind of some of the outreach and education and immediate interface with the state. So they've decided to break into the FEMA regions, have representatives within each FEMA region. So you'll have a FirstNet regional person that you will work with, potentially in addition to a state point of contact. They also are going to identify dedicated members to support federal engagements, federal interaction, as well as tribal. Understanding that we know the law stated that tribal representation would go through the state point of contact. That is typically not, obviously, how tribal nations, as sovereign nations, operate. They are sovereign nations, so that's why they're still understanding some of the the limitations of the law. They want to make sure that they have ways that they can engage tribal. It doesn't mean that within the states you certainly can't continue to work with your tribal constituents. But FirstNet will also have dedicated members there to support tribal as well as federal engagement. So a a lot of times there's been questions of who engages the federal agencies within the state. And the response from FirstNet has been basically, if you have existing relationships within the state, they're working within some of your governing bodies, then by all means continue to work with those groups, but don't feel like it's the state's responsibility to engage all federal agencies within the state. They will be doing that through what's called the AZPSIC, the Emergency Communications Preparedness Council. It's a council that represents the major federal organizations, so they've already started engagement there to work at the headquarters level down. But certainly, as I said, the local levels and the relationships you've already built, sometimes that's a good way to get input as well. Any questions so far? Yes.
Hey, just kind of as an agency, take me through, if you can, today I'm a customer of Verizon using their data services.
Right.
So when this comes, what kind of is the main differences I'm going to see? Because I'll go to a Verizon rep and I'll go to their technical support, I'll get things. What changes am I going to see when FirstNet comes to the door?
Right, so great question. And for those on the phone, the question is basically just how would this differ from how you would get your services today through a Verizon or commercial carrier? So it's really going to be a very similar model just from the standpoint of billing and getting some of those services. You'll get devices from them just like you would today. Provisioning will be a little bit different, obviously, because it's a controlled access network, so it's not like this anyone could walk into the FirstNet store and buy your device or however that will work.
So you're saying that I get my devices where?
You would get them through FirstNet, so they will be, yeah.
So you're pretty much, like I said, you're going to be like, instead of I'm going to Verizon, I'm going to you for the same thing.
Exactly. So right, not me. So I'm DHS, Office of Emergency Communications, but yes.
I put your name.
I will not be your FirstNet representative for procuring devices. But yeah, so it'll be, like I said, I mean, some ways to look at it, and I've heard it mentioned recently, is it's going to be the fifth nationwide carrier behind the big four, and so it'll look from some instances very similar to that, where you go and you get your devices, you get your service, you get your monthly bill, you're paying your monthly bill. Some of the differences, though, will obviously be just the controlled access to the network, some of the potential prioritization and added uniqueness or capabilities that the network would have that you may not get on the commercial sector. So, prioritization is a big one. I'll talk a little bit more too about just some of the access to network operations or network maintenance or network monitoring. That type of potential is there.
Just a follow-up question.
Yeah.
So, am I going to necessarily need additional resources or budget in order to support this?
So, another good question. Would you need additional?
Are you taking something away that I got to fill in somewhere else, or
correct?
You're going to pay me so much money that I can hire a couple?
So the primary target of this initially is to really replace whatever you're using today for commercial data services, because now you've got the benefit if it's a controlled network, it's added redundancy, reliability, some of those factors. But they also recognize, FirstNet has been told many times over that the costs will have to be very competitive to what users pay for their commercial services today, because they're getting by, they're making, you've built operational procedures around how you use those networks today, and so you're making good use of them. And to think that you're going to go on to this, just automatically move over to a new network that's maybe twice the cost, for example, or 50% increase, is not feasible, and it's not required by anyone. So this would really just be, it would be FirstNet service becomes available. If you're compelled to go use that service, then you would migrate all of your commercial services over to them, use their devices, use their network, start paying and going through just like you would today with your commercial services. They would be your new service provider, basically. Make sense? Yeah, good question. Any other questions so far? I've been cruising through. All right, so moving on then. So in the law, it also stood up a public safety advisory committee. So this was the committee that was going to advise the board on specific public safety requirements. So it consists of 41 members. It has an executive committee. Chief Harlan McEwen chairs that executive committee and the board. And they've been working with FirstNet very closely and have a handful of initiatives that they're working on and providing input and feedback to the board. You can see them there. Some pretty important ones on public safety grade, identity management. This is going to be some of the unique requirements of this network that this group is tackling so far. The FirstNet 3-in-1 approach. So this slide has been briefed many times by FirstNet, so we're just taking this to kind of help illustrate the approach, the thought process behind. So FirstNet recognizes that public safety operates has jurisdiction throughout the entire country, and that the feasibility of building out a terrestrial network just isn't cost effective. So you certainly are going to target the build out of the terrestrial network, called the fixed sites, the RAN, right, where you have the majority of users, the majority of operations. And that could be multiple networks. It could be the FirstNet network, that they could strike roaming agreements or have partnerships with other carriers, and so you've got potentially multiple networks, terrestrial networks you could fall back onto, much like the big carriers do today, where they work with local, smaller regional carriers that so you kind of roam onto their networks. That where you don't have coverage for terrestrial networks, they're looking at a satellite kind of overlay to provide connectivity, and that can be done in a couple of different ways. It can be done where that you may have a device in your particular vehicle that talks LTE first and maybe satellite second. So if you fall outside of the coverage footprint of this terrestrial system, then you move on to that satellite system. So you still retain coverage. And a good example is, the highway patrol that have big area to patrol. Their jurisdiction is huge, and they might be out where there's just you run outside of coverage of terrestrial networks. And if their devices are equipped, they could potentially migrate onto the satellite system and maintain some level of connectivity. And I know there's many challenges to that. Moving from one terrestrial network to a very different network over satellite. Bandwidth restraints, costing model. There's a lot of challenges, but there's a lot of work going on in that area as well. So that's what that's kind of the vision of looking into. If you're equipped, then that's a service or option you want to have, that you can have that fallback. Yes.
Would that be running over a commercial satellite network, or are you Constellation satellite?
Yeah, that would be partnering with an existing commercial satellite system, yeah. So that would be using, timer circuits on some commercial satellite system. What's that?
So a possibility could be like the new Arabian Constellation that's putting up.
Yeah, it's an example. That's right. So there's a lot of new satellite technology going up, and that's actually, I think, why this looks somewhat promising, because there's a lot more technology advancement, smaller form factor antennas, on the move technology, a lot of more competition. But yeah, it would be they're not going to try to put up their own system. But that satellite system then could also be leveraged for deployable systems as well, just like we have often today, where you have some type of deployable cell on wheels or site on wheels or mobile comm vehicle, and it has satellite connectivity. And then it would just put up like a LTE bubble around the vehicle. So users, and so maybe it goes to a high spot, or it's at some remote location, and everyone else is there with just their normal LTE handset or device. They would connect into that deployable system, and that deployable system would then be the one that connects back over satellite back into the network, providing connectivity. So that's a big one for when we look at our maps later on. And if you have really remote areas of the state where it just doesn't make sense potentially to have terrestrial coverage or build out terrestrial coverage, this would be the solution that could be deployed when coverage is needed in those areas. So any other questions on that? Okay. So the overall solution that FirstNet has recognized that they're not looking at this being like another data pipe where you unplug your USB modem and you plug in a new one and you just have a data pipe access. They're really targeting a complete solution. And this kind of gets back to your question about what I get with FirstNet over or differently from what I would get from my commercial providers today. So certainly the basic communications that you would get, just voice calls and about messaging and typical data applications. They're looking at applications. How could they support different applications? Would it be a FirstNet storefront? Would it be when you get your FirstNet device, maybe a base set of applications come with it? They're exploring different options there, but they certainly are looking into how applications will be supported on the network and how there would be FirstNet kind of supported applications, in addition to all the applications that you would normally want to run on the network that you have today. Different services related to public safety needs, so for data storage, record management, that could be something that maybe they've got a big warehouse or data facilities, and you as part of your FirstNet service, you get some of these services as well that go with it. And then just some of the unique capabilities that this network will offer. So certainly the ability to see into the health and the status of the network and see where users are, that will be, I think, a distinctive advantage of something like this that you wouldn't have necessarily over your commercial network. Provisioning and activation, that control the network, you to decide who goes on, who doesn't, or just the fact that there'll be a limited user set, compared to commercial where everyone comes on. And then additionally, with that user base that comes on, there'll be, certain levels of priority on the network. And then there's also been a lot of talk about dynamic priority as well. So depending on if there's a specific event or specific users or a certain type of application, maybe streaming video is very important for a certain event, and maybe not normally, this ability to dynamically change the priorities of the network to support whatever the missions are something that you won't get in your commercial network today. Commercial networks today, everyone is equal. It's all best effort traffic. There's no priority to quality of service on the LTE networks today. Now that might change as voice and stuff are added, but it's not done today. So that's something that definitely would be unique to public safety network, FirstNet. All right, so we keep moving here. Consultation. So the law stated that FirstNet is to work with a single point of contact in every state, and that single point of contact will be the representative, can represent a body, but that will be the interface between FirstNet and the state. And part of that consultation required in the law is to do these things. So the construction of the core and the RAN build-out. So even though I said, the core is FirstNet's responsibility, they're still going to work with the state on where that is, how that works, what the connectivity looks like. Certainly where the RAN is built out, the placement of towers, because that drives coverage. The states will know best where they need coverage, how they need coverage, what type of coverage they need. So that's definitely a key component of consultation. We'll talk a little bit more about that today. That drives the coverage area of the network, but different levels of coverage as well. Where do you need in-building coverage versus vehicular coverage is good enough. Some of the uniqueness of this network obviously are that it's public safety grade. So what are some of the requirements for hardening, security, reliability, resiliency? All those will be discussion topics. Priority of users, that's a big one, but that's probably something that will come later in the process. User selection, and then ultimately training. So these are the things required by law to be covered in consultation. I do know that, we've worked very closely with FirstNet, that there's a lot of, and there's, as you know, working with it, there's a lot of other things that are being discussed and will likely be included in this consultation process, but these are the ones that are required by the law. And then SLIG-P, that's the grant program that we've mentioned that was, is there to support the states to support this interaction, this consultation. So, because that's one of the areas required, that's one of the reasons why we're talking about this today is an allowable activity under SLIG-P, and it's one of the things that's going to drive a lot of other activities in this process. So knowing where your coverage is a key component and one that will be discussed early in the process. So we've added a few of the new slides that were presented by FirstNet, trying to kind of further define this consultation process for you. So at the end of the day, when this consultation process ends, it culminates in a state plan, and that state plan will identify what will the FirstNet build-out look like potentially in the state of Arizona. It'll include inputs, from state, local, tribal, regional, rural, metro. All these these are the representatives required to participate in this per the law. So there's also, though, we know there's going to be inputs we already talked about from the federal side, and where they would potentially respond because they're a viable user base potentially for this network. And then there's also going to be just identifying all those existing assets that aren't necessarily supported here. That will be done by FirstNet as well, but it will be fed up in this plan. So a couple of things we're trying to show here is that, one, your responsibility lies here. FirstNet will work these areas, but it'll still get incorporated in the state plan so you can see it. You can see what they've found, but that's not your responsibility. So you don't need to worry about going out to all the NGOs, all the private utilities necessarily, and gathering, or the commercial, tower companies. They will work that information. It's not to say that you couldn't help them work that in your state, but it's not necessarily your responsibility. Your responsibility lies here. All that information is rolled up into a state plan, is delivered for the governor to make the decision, hopefully, if they want to accept the state plan or opt out and try to develop their own state plan. So just a few of the principles for consultation. This is it's definitely going to be an iterative, active process. This is not something that they're looking to, that FirstNet's looking to kind of push information to you, receive it back, go off, do their thing, come back with a state plan. They are looking at several meetings, a lot of engagement, a lot of dialogue. They want to make sure that they've captured the state inputs, the state requirements in developing and building out the state plan. Early in the process, they will do, the message has been received loud and clear. The states want to know what their roles and responsibilities are and kind of what the big plan is so they can plan accordingly. So they're working on their best to identify, what is their responsibility, what will be your responsibility, what will we do together so that states can plan accordingly. FirstNet fully recognizes that there's a lot of work that could be done. There's a lot of data that could be collected. There's a lot of nice-to-have information. Frankly, there's just not enough time and money in a grant to gather all that. So they're really going to be focused on identifying what is minimally essential to develop this plan, to lighten the burden on the state so that you don't have to go out and collect information that's kind of nice to have. And they'll also do their best to gather up what they have and provide to the states for you to review, comment on. That's like we're doing today. So whatever they can gather and present to you to provide, that they'll do their best to try to really minimize that burden on the states. I mentioned, iterative, active process, and at the end of the day, the state plan will be delivered to the state. And as I've said multiple times, hopefully by the time the final state plan is delivered and is presented up to the governor, there will be nothing new in that. It will be something that you've all seen many times, you've worked together in developing, and it'll just be a matter of formality at that point. So at a very high level, there's going to be a couple of key areas going on in this process. So once consultation starts with this initial meeting, it's going to kind of separate into two tracks here. There's going to be kind of the technical design track, and then you're also going to have kind of that more operational or business planning side. So knowing your users, costing, some of the different requirements that drive the operational and business side of it. And then you've got some of the requirements of where you're building this network out. And then those things, obviously there's give and take between those. So those will go into the asset selection identification and how these two relate. So as this process goes on in these parallel tracks and you're doing this kind of together with FirstNet, you're doing this interactive process, and eventually, you'll get results. You'll have your ultimate design, you'll have your ultimate business plan, the operational components, they'll all be brought together into the state plan. So the state plan is not just going to be here's your coverage design for the network, take it or leave it. It's going to cover, the operational side of it, the business side of it, as well as the technical design side of it. All right, so initial consultation. We're just going to kind of jump into each of these really quick and break them down a little bit more. So we know that initial consultation, they definitely want to focus on users, identifying users. Who are your users, potentially? No one's committing to anything at this point. How many do you have? Where do they operate? How many potential devices do they have? Because that's really ultimately, at the end of the day, you're paying for devices, you're not paying for users. So I'm sorry, there will be a big discussion around users of that initial consultation, one of the big things that they need to know. There will also be a discussion around coverage. That's why we're having this workshop today. So the initial consultation will be heavy on coverage. We'll talk about roles and responsibilities, some planning, and then messaging and outreach, everyone knows that this is a huge effort to try to really get the word out doing messaging and outreach. In fact, I think the SLIG-P grant, it was overwhelmingly, this was the messaging and outreach was the biggest investment by the states. So FirstNet wants to make sure that they will help provide, resources, materials that can help with your messaging and outreach, talk to you about the strategy or plan, so that, it's hopefully they know what you're intending to do. They can serve you with the resources you need, that the messaging that FirstNet has, working with the states is, clear, hopefully, and consistent throughout multiple states and all the constituents involved. And again, one of the principles, as I mentioned before, that they're always going to try to provide as much information as they can up front to allow you to comment and response rather than kind of having to start from a clean slate. Asset identification. So this is still always a big question of how are you going to identify assets, where are they coming from, when will this process take place. So this is definitely the next step in the process. And they will definitely, provide guidance and methodologies and the tools required to do that. But really, they're showing here is that there's a lot of assets that are potentially available for use, but there's a lot of considerations to make before you get down to the assets that will be most ideal to use for the network. So, are they in the right location? Do they have they met the right hardening requirements for the public safety grade? What does access and operations look like on them? Legal, how does the title to them look? What is the cost? A lot of considerations that will go into this asset selection process. And really the goal here, though, is for SLIG-P Phase 2, so SLIG-P is broken into two phases. Phase 1 is a lot of the activities going on right now, outreach, education, identifying users. Phase 2 is really focused on identifying state assets that can be brought to bear to leverage by FirstNet. So that hasn't started yet. That before it gets started, it will be approved.
Nobody's asked any questions on this, but I know you just said state assets. Are you talking about state assets, including local jurisdictional assets as well as tribal assets?
Absolutely. State, local, tribal, yes. Yes. So anything within the state.
Within the state.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
Going back to that, any asset that
You're not used to me being this quiet, so now everybody's looking
no,
at me. Sorry.
No, I'm glad you had the question. So, yeah, any asset that's available that could be leveraged to build up the network, there's a lot of considerations they'll make on it, but they want to kind of know all possibilities so that they can do things smartly.
What's the incentive for the locals to approve their asset and be considered as part of the
pay for the use of that asset. So that they're looking at different ways. That hasn't been decided. There's been a lot of proposed ideas, but if they're going to come use that asset, there would be compensation for that, just like there would be on a commercial site.
I have a question from Michael Holmes on the, you might want to look at chat. Actually threw one out through chat, but wants to know if it's going to be CGIS compliant and what are the security aspects of the network?
Yeah, thanks. I don't have a good view of the chat window here, so yes, they have cybersecurity. We talked a little bit about it as a huge consideration. They recognize that to use this network, that users will want to use their typical applications that they use today. So they've already looked into CGIS, all the security requirements for running, law enforcement, federal, local, state applications, and so that's definitely be taken into consideration and will be compliant so that those services can be run on the network. Good questions. Any other questions? All right. Did you just get a text on that?
Yeah, I did.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. I don't know how we look at the chat window. Figure not, yeah. So I guess for the users on the phone, if you have a question, feel free, please, just to jump in. Yeah. So I think the best way for examples like that is if you want to gain access to those databases through this network, it would work much like you do today and however you're gaining access. So if you're gaining access to those through the internet, you have your security provisions set up for people to gain access to it, it would be much the same, where you would just be, you'd be connected into this network differently. So it's a different way to do it. So.
No one else will openly have access to your data. We have just an issue about this HIPAA and then some open procedures and technology stuff. So all these databases with different stakeholders, all of it, and have your whole data you're seeing, ideally with FirstNet all that, just another transfer of another network. It still goes on for years.
We don't need to worry about developing currently of software applications with and we don't need to be doing the integration.
I don't believe so.
Part of the NISTIC statement of requirements was specifically to allow for access to home networks for users and to VPN into their home system. So that has been woven into the requirements for FirstNet to follow.
So you're learning.
Yeah, connecting to the network won't, just kind of automatically open it up to all potential people. They'll still have you'll still have the ability to secure things the same way you've done in the past. But certainly, you want to make sure that there's connectivity into it somehow. So whatever that connectivity is, whether it's just if you have some specific dedicated connectivity used today, you want to make sure that it gets rolled over. If it's just connecting to the internet using VPN access over it, that can be supported as well. Good question. Any other questions before we continue on? All right. So asset selection was very important. It will be coming down the path. It'll just be a little bit down further once SLIC-P phase 2 is started and the budgets have been approved and released, and there's a process and tools and methodologies for collecting this. That's when this process will start to take place. The RAN design. So as I mentioned, one of the principles is it's going to be a very interactive process, a lot of dialogue. FirstNet is looking at a way to kind of phase this in, so release a preliminary design for the states to review, provide feedback on. Then as they get feedback and more information, you just start to refine that design, take another look at maybe an intermediate design, and then continue to build into the design until finally you get to a critical design. So a very iterative process, more information, refining this to hopefully get all the state input, and captured and fed into the ultimate design that gets included in the state plan. I mentioned, that there's going to be parallel tracks. So once you have that state design going on, you're also going to have the whole operations side. So to address issues like local control, prioritization, training, security, those were specifically called out in the law. So those will be addressed without a doubt. There will be other issues as well. So all the operational aspects of where, the network operations centers, or how you gain access into the health and monitoring of the network, the user assumptions, all those types of things will be kind of captured in that operations plan, or the operations section or component of the plan. And then finally, this plan is put together. It will identify the funding identified to build up this network. There will be, hopefully, like I said, many opportunities for the states to review everything that's going in, and it goes to the governor for signature. The governor has 90 days to decide if they want to accept the plan. If not, then they have the ability to opt out. We'll talk about that. So the opt-out process procedure. So once that state plan is delivered, as I mentioned, 90 days for the governor to look at, decide if they want to accept the FirstNet provided plan or opt out. If they decide to opt out, there's 6 months for the state to develop their own plan. And the opt-out plan must be basically, show equivalent or how they're going to address a lot of the same components or aspects of the plan that was provided by FirstNet. So both from a technical and physical capability to operate the network, how it will be maintained with ongoing interoperability and connectivity to the nationwide network, that they've got the capacity to complete the project, that will still be cost effective, comparable in cost, and deliver the same resources and capability performance. and then it will have comparable security, coverage, quality of service. So that's why that plan will have all those components that go into the build out of a network, and if the state opts out, that will be measured against all those similar components in the plan. So once the state, if they choose to opt out, you build up a separate plan. That plan is submitted. The FCC actually is the one that will approve the plan. If you approve the plan, you go forward. The state can apply for a grant to get some of those funds to actually build out the network. If the plan is disapproved, then you go back to the plan that was provided by FirstNet. So any questions on opt-out? One of the big questions on this has always been, well, if the state opts out and the revenue that's generated from the network, just like FirstNet's requirement, if the states opt out, all proceeds or revenue from the network that's generated must go back into the network. So any state that opts out and builds out their own RAN and maintains their own RAN, all fees will go back into that network. Just like FirstNet, any fees, it's not a for-profit organization. All proceeds from the network go back into the network. All right, so we've talked a little bit about SLIG-P. There's a lot of activities for phase one. That's the phase that's going on right now. Establishing your governance, making sure you've got representation with local stakeholders, outreach education, identifying users. You can see them all here. There's a lot of activities. Users is one that is an allowable activity, and that's another one that was going to be requested early in this process from FirstNet, so that's another focus area that we'll get into later today. And at the end of the day, this is kind of the vision for what it looks like. So you've got the FirstNet core that's been built out that covers, connectivity throughout the whole nation, and then you have these 56 state and territory RAN designs that were negotiated, and provided to the state, agreed upon, and then built out within each state. And whether that was a FirstNet built RAN or a state who maybe opt-out RAN, they all eventually still connect back into the same core so that you have this nationwide network, regardless of how the local RANs were built out. So that's kind of the big vision, tying this all back together at the end of the day. So any questions on any of that we've discussed? Because this will be now where we'll kind of jump into the next topic of discussion.
Not so much a question, but first of all, it sounds like number one, regardless of what happens, we've got to do it period. We're either doing it through FirstNet or we're doing it through the state.
Say that again, I'm sorry?
First of all, it looks like we're going to have to do this no matter what, either through FirstNet or through the state.
I got you.
Okay? So I think, when we spoke earlier, you said the pricing, the cost on this would be comparable to what we're currently getting through our local systems. I would probably submit it'd have to be lower because this I know works. This looks like healthcare.gov for my data. Okay?
Right.
So that's a big concern, especially for rural agencies like ours.
Absolutely.
Now I have to invest money in new systems, and I know when P25 became the standard, my radio cost doubled. And that's the concern I see coming from a rural agency perspective is now I've got something mandated that I have to do, but all my costs are now going to double. And I derive no extra benefit from having to buy all that P25 equipment because the infrastructure isn't there to support it. In our area, we have two primary providers for data services, Verizon and Cell One. But for instance, White Mountain Apache Tribe, Cell One, it's an exclusive use zone. So the minute you cross over the reservation, Verizon is done. We're talking about leveraging. So are we looking at incorporating those Verizon and Cell One sites that already exist to support this new process, or are we going to look at building right along next to all of this?
No, so a lot of good questions, a lot of points. I'll try to hit on them, and if I missed any, please, let me know. So on the last one there, certainly they want to look at existing sites. So a Verizon site, for example, Verizon really doesn't own a lot of their sites. They lease sites from tower companies. So those tower companies can lease space to FirstNet or whoever else, just like they do to Verizon today. So that they plan to target, a lot of those same companies, but they've got the ability where they can also go with, state, local, tribal assets as well. So on those, the tribal lands, for example, if they've got a tower site there, and they want to make sure they have coverage for FirstNet within their area, then they can potentially negotiate something to use those sites. So there's a lot of potential to get on a lot more sites that maybe typical commercial carriers don't have, but they will be leveraging as many assets as they can to provide the coverage that they need. As far as the cost and the confidence that users will have, I don't disagree with you at all. I mean, that's a huge area that FirstNet knows that they're going to have to build up that trust and confidence of the public safety community before they ever migrate over. And the difference between that P25 example you had is that there's a lot more competition in this market, right? Because they can continue using their commercial services today, whereas in the P25 example, they really didn't have a lot of other options. So that you're kind of stuck with maybe incurring some of those additional costs. But in this, if the cost is twice as much, you're probably not going to get a lot of people leaving their commercial services to pay twice as much for access to this network. So, I understand the challenges, and I agree with you. It's different, but I think there are some differences that might make it where it won't be some following past history.
And Rich, just to clarify one thing, the law requires that the network be built, whether it's by FirstNet or the state opting out the state. The law does not require public safety participation.
Right.
So that's going to be a key driver for FirstNet to keep costs down. Certainly, default standards and desire for interoperability will be a driver to get everybody participating. There's not a requirement that your agency is going to have to be on that. So that's why this funding is so critical. Figure out ways to do it that the coverage will be right, that the cost can be down, and make it a viable option for
Well, and Mike, I mean, I'm sure the law doesn't have that.
over time.
If I want the money.
So
that's, I see some concern. That would be my concern.
Yeah.
We have to take more to get something that doesn't necessarily.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's definitely more kind of the commercial model from the standpoint of they're going to try to get as much input as they can from you, and then build up a network or a system to provide service to you, and then you can choose whether or not you want to use it or not. So there's no additional cost that you have to incur to help get that service built up. You just have the unique opportunity to provide that input to make sure that it's going to meet what your needs are.
And that's why the Janaury is so critical for it. It doesn't come out, it doesn't talk to you guys. It's not going to know what your requirements are to start with. What's more what you're even paying right now. And if they don't get that, they get that cost model and they roll it out. Like Brian was saying, they roll it out and it's twice as money for who knows, maybe not even capability. Yeah, from this model, you're not going to go. They know that. That's what's really
Yeah, question for that?
Yeah, from a radio application longer term.
Yeah.
Radio application, would our equipment have to be compatible to operate within the 700 megahertz?
Yes, most definitely. So today there's not a lot of equipment out there that's capable of operating in that band 14 or band class 14. So you in order to operate on this network, you'd have to procure equipment that would be capable to operate on it. So yeah, down the road, right, when they get the data, and a lot of people associate, cell phones and stuff. There's no reason that you couldn't still have some of the old form factors that users are used to using today, and they're just capable of operating on this new network, an LTE network. In fact, that's what some of the providers are already doing today, building radios that will be capable of operating on both LTE and P25, for example, to kind of bridge that gap.
We have a little bit of an issue with that, and when we have our opportunity for outreach, we'll explain this, and have those kind of devices on it.
Not allowed.
You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
We have to think radios, we have to, that's why I'm asking, and I missed the determination of how long it's before the consideration.
I got you. So there's two ways to answer that question of when LMR would kind of get introduced. So in the near term, one of the big questions is how will LMR be integrated into the network? So maybe the legacy users on their LMR networks can still support voice communications between the two networks. So that's definitely an area that's being looked at. So how do you continue to operate and leverage your existing networks, but tie them into this network? So if you do have users maybe operating, making a phone call, they could still tie into maybe some of those channels or talk groups on your LMR systems. So that LMR to LTE connection would be kind of the first way to bridge that gap. Down the road, when this all becomes one consolidated network, way down the road, I specifically did not give a time frame for that because no one really knows. I mean, it's a really good question of when it would be available. It'll be several years before you can really, not only would the technology support it, but as we've talked about, when the community would trust it and start to adopt it. So, another question? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm on the PSAC. I work with fire service and PSAC. One of the things that you were mentioning was the cost associated with devices and access fees and those kinds of things. Things that we're recognizing is that it does have to be competitive. You might pay a little more because of the security and local control kind of things, but the thing is you don't have to change the local fees. You can change over some of it on commercial. Identify key users that will be on. Question about the mission critical fire service is a difficult position. Our devices have to go in. You're telling us decades. It's not a situation where you need to put up your money into form factors that you need for your type of work. Standards will have to be developed that there isn't, with the manufacturer. Just so I'm clear on that, I think my question is saying that, let's take FirstNet up, and now they're going to have a OEC, that for your corrections officer, they would truly need an LMR only, you wouldn't actually want them to have, so there is, right? Okay.
There's a potential for them at any moment to be taken by the my concern also is that it may not be an issue, but this can probably
Right.
And that's what this workshop does.
Exactly. So those are so we'll talk about that later, actually in the next section, on the coverage component, but on the devices uniqueness, that's going to be a really good example of something you'd want to bring up in the consultation process to identify all those unique requirements that you need to operate with. So because I mentioned earlier on, they're already working on devices and that's going to be an area they can focus on, but they recognize that there's going to be some unique device requirements, and those are great ones to make sure that they're aware of and have captured.
What the PSAC really wants to do is the identification, the security, the traffic, the person, not necessarily the device.
I've been, Michael will tell you, I've been voicing it. He talks
So
I heard you say about 10 years. Yeah?
I didn't say 10 years.
Well,
no, but from a
no sooner than 10 years.
it's really tough to estimate. I mean, I think I don't think there's any way it's going to be any sooner than 5 or 6 years. 10 years is kind of the general rule. I think that's entirely reasonable. But as this process evolves, and some of those key drivers that are driving those developments in that area that will make this potentially public safety grade and to support mission critical voice, there'll be a lot more information and so that the estimation of when it'll be available will be better. Right now, it's really difficult to estimate. So I think 10 years is probably the best guess at this point. Any other questions? All right, this I think is a good time to take a break. So maybe we can go take, say like 10 minutes? 10 or 15. Yeah, 10, 15 minutes. Bring it back, and then we'll get started then on the coverage and the user discussion. Did you want to say anything before? To reiterate then really quickly, the slides will be available. We'll make those available through Michael and Justin and however they want to distribute through the team. I'm sure there'll be different ways. This is also being recorded, the session is. And then the last other question, which I think we covered, but just to make sure everyone is crystal clear, there will be no requirement for anyone there will be no mandate for the use of this network. This will be a network that's used by choice. So if the prices or the service aren't compelling to the user, then the users or the agencies don't have to use it. So, all right. So now jumping into the next topic, we kind of did the background, got some questions. Now we're going to focus on the two areas that we really want the states to kind of help start thinking about to prep them for consultation, and that is coverage and users. So we did our best to gather up as much information as we could on a national basis from different GIS data sets. We worked with FirstNet to make sure that some of the things that we're coming up with were going to be within reason, and some of the assumptions we made were reasonable. And we put together a baseline for you to start looking at to make considerations for how do you want to determine where you want coverage throughout the state and what levels of coverage. So that's what we'll go through these maps. These maps are just really there, just to help guide this discussion. We'll provide all the data we have in GIS format. So if you have, your GIS team or members and you want to take this into a deeper dive, you can do that. We also, on the back of the book, we created or included county sheets, county worksheets, knowing that in some areas, some states want to kind of dive down to the county level. So you kind of get a snapshot of your county, what this breakdown would look like for your county, and then also from information we have on the agencies and the number of users represented by those agencies. So those are just, again, examples that can be used or leveraged. You don't have to use them. You can come up with your own, but it's just something to try to help you if you want to leverage them and gather enough some of this information. All right. So the focus is on coverage, not infrastructure. We're not going to talk about where sites are, who has existing sites. This is simply just determining where you need coverage in the state and what levels of coverage you need. That's the goal of this. This is nothing is final. This is just merely just to start the discussion, to get you thinking about how you want to go about what information do you want to use to kind of help drive your baseline potentially, or alter this baseline, or what information you want to use to tailor the baseline. And then just remembering that this is a mobile data solution. Voice is yet to come, but understanding also that voice actually requires less bandwidth than what will probably be targeted for the data thresholds. So likely if this is built out with the data thresholds, then voice would be supported because it's lower bandwidth on the network once it comes about. So the reason we're talking about these things is coverage and users and capacity are the two critical aspects that go into the design of a network. You need to know where you need coverage and what levels of coverage you need, along with the users, to come up with that. And the reason you need it, we'll talk about it more, is that with this technology, it's a little bit different, where coverage can be driven by the number of users you have. So it can be a capacity-driven design, or it can be a coverage-driven design. And that's typically solely based on the number of users you have. If it's fewer number of users, lower volume, then it's probably going to be a coverage area that drives the design. If it's an urban area where you have a lot of users, it's going to be a user-driven design. And that's why a lot of times you'll see cell sites around the area, they're not very tall, or they don't put the antenna sometimes all the way up on the tower. And that's not because the technology doesn't necessarily support it. It's just because they're designing for capacity. They're trying to keep the number of users appropriate for the coverage footprint for that site. And we'll get into that more too. So this is just talking about, again, some of the information that FirstNet presented, that the goal, from what we understand, is that they're going to provide some of this information for the states to comment on as well. So kind of this similar process. So if you don't have an estimation of what your coverage objective would be, then the FirstNet would have one that they would like to socialize with you in starting this process, same with users. and this information. So they will have information that will be provided early in the consultation process. All right, so getting started here. We've started with just state boundary, the counties, and census designated places. So these are any place that what we're really trying to find here are population centers, knowing that public safety typically operates where there's people. They don't always operate where there are people. We know that the jurisdictions, span the state boundary. But when you're trying to kind of prioritize coverage and where you would need coverage, looking at where you have population centers, we thought was a good place to to start out. So, census designated places is an area identified by the U.S. Census that basically is a population center. I mean, the easiest way to say it. So this is just showing that basic map. So then we added a few more things to this map. Now, remember, when you have it in a GIS format, you can turn on and off every one of these layers and look at it however you want to, zoom in, zoom out. But just for the sake of discussion, we're just kind of showing how you can roll in additional layers. So we've added federally recognized tribes. Knowing here in Arizona you have a few. So that's a good way to look at this. Railroads, rivers, and then the highway system, the national highway system. So this is an important one to take a look at, knowing that there's a lot of traffic along the highways, and that's definitely an area where you would likely want coverage. So in addition to census designated places, we also looked at population density. So the U.S. Census breaks population density into census blocks, which are different sizes of areas, and then specify the population within each of those blocks. So we've kind of shown here where you've got really strong density, more than 2,500 people per square mile. Then you've got this threshold of 1,000 people, which is kind of defines the threshold for urban areas and clusters of 1,000 people per square mile. And then what a lot of people use as kind of a threshold for what's rural or not, and that's 5 people per square mile. And we'll talk a little bit more and see how this kind of translates into coverage. So different ways to look at population density, and some significant thresholds are shown on this map. All right, so before we get into looking at coverage, we first want to make sure that everyone understands kind of how this works a little bit. So FirstNet has basically told us, and the way that they're looking at some of the preliminary modeling and work that they're doing, is that they're targeting kind of 3 basic levels of coverage. So where would you need in-building coverage, where would you need handheld coverage, and where would you need a vehicular level coverage? And the way that translates to coverage is that if you need in-building coverage, that coverage footprint of a site is going to be very small. You need to have a very strong signal to penetrate buildings. If you need handheld coverage, then the coverage footprint of that site gets a little bit bigger because the performance isn't quite as stringent. And then finally, if you have vehicular level coverage required, the coverage footprint for that site gets much larger. So that's kind of the difference and why it's important to know what level of coverage you want, because that's going to drive how many sites are needed to build out that network, in addition to the user capacity as well. Note too that when you look at coverage and you see coverage maps, right now we're going to be talking coverage objectives, but ultimately when you get a coverage map provided to you, there's going to be specified to some reliability and data rate threshold. That's what drives what that map looks like. And it's also what's going to be very different from what the commercial providers provide in their maps, right? They're not driving to some high reliability that public safety needs, and the data rate that they're specifying is probably very much lower than what FirstNet might be looking for their threshold. So knowing that these factors determine what that coverage footprint looks like is important, because it becomes very important when you're trying to compare side by side. So if, for example, if they decided to lower the reliability or change the data rate, then that actually would change what that coverage footprint would look like. So you're not doing anything to the site, you're not doing anything to, it's just a matter of how you are trying to depict where you would have coverage in the site. So knowing these factors is important and how that affects the coverage footprint. So oftentimes it's a little confusing of what is the difference. Yes, question?
On the in-building coverage, is there a specific building type that they have identified as the typical building, or is that driven by GIS data for economic construction in certain areas?
for in-building coverage?
Yeah, because like meaning high-rise is a different resistance from RF than say, wooden structure.
Right, correct. So when they specify in-building, they'll have different ways that they'll look at the building types to figure out how much additional margin they need to penetrate that building. So that's not something for you guys to identify or worry about. You just identify, I need in-building here. They'll figure out what type of building it is and then what type of penetration it is. A couple of questions on the chat window. What or who defines reliable coverage? So this is going to be one of those factors of consultation, a great consultation of, it's likely that FirstNet will present or recommend kind of the way they're looking at it. But we've talked to several states and we've already seen a wide variety of opinions on reliability factors and minimum data rates. Some states kind of want to know, when you show me coverage, I just want to know where I'm going to get service. Where am I going to get at least one bar? And so I know I've got some type of connectivity. Others are saying, no, I want high data rates minimally at any place where you're showing me I have coverage. And if I get more data beyond that, so be it. But wherever you show coverage, I want it to be where I know I've got a very reliable high data rate. So that's going to be something that will just be a consultation topic because it will drive what that coverage map looks like and potentially how many sites are needed to build out the site. Another question with regard to coverage, is user density being considered, as there could be anywhere from 1 to several hundred users located in a specific area at one time? Absolutely, user density is very important. We will talk about user density in the kind of the user section. We've got a couple of slides similar to this to point out how the importance of user density and how it affects the system. So we'll get to that. Good question. Another point was made that for LMR we should strive for full in-building coverage, or we do strive for full in-building coverage. And yeah, so that's no different here. If the requirement for you to operate in certain areas for in-building coverage, whether it's city limits, I know that's commonly a way that it's bound, then those are the type of requirements you would pass back to FirstNet that this is where we want in-building coverage and begin that consultation process. So, questions? So, coverage objective different from a coverage map. And the reason we want to go through this is that when we look at these maps later on, those are coverage objectives, where you need coverage. It's very different from where you would actually get coverage based on the coverage study. So, coverage objective, where you need coverage maps, which will come later in the process, will actually show you where you're going to get coverage or where coverage is predicted. So just to try to illustrate that, so let's take, for example, a highway. You've got a highway in the rural part of the state, and so you said, for this highway, we want to make sure that the highway is at least covered with mobile level coverage for a vehicle driving along the highway. So you would say, okay, the coverage objective then is we'll make this the light green or whatever the bucket is for vehicular level coverage. And then when you place the sites along that highway, you can see that there's going to be a lot more coverage that you would have than just what's along that highway. You're not going to just have a beam of coverage along the highway and that's what's covered. You're going to get a lot of coverage. And not only would you get a lot of coverage, in this case, you want to make sure it's built out for vehicular level so you can kind of go all the way out to the cell edge. But you're going to get some in-building or very strong signals, some handheld coverage along that way. You might not have handheld coverage along the whole thing, but you certainly would get it in pockets. So that's just the way that, depending on how you identify these different levels of coverage, you're going to get more than kind of what you asked for. And that's why right now we're just specifying objectives, but later on you'll get a better sense of what the actual coverage will look like from those resulting objectives. So is that, any questions on that? All right. There was a question on throughput already and how that's measured, and so this is a good example, just trying to show how throughput is different in LTE and what a resulting coverage map may look like a little bit differently than what you might be familiar with LMR. So in this case, and you've seen that on some of the commercial maps too, maybe, where they'll show like darker shades where you'd have a really strong signal versus maybe medium or lighter shades. So this technology is very dynamic in how it adjusts your throughput levels based on your signal quality and how well you're able to receive signal and perform on that. So for example, if you're very close to the site, you've got a very strong signal, it's going to boost up your throughput because it can take advantage of that strong signal. And as you get further away from the site, or if you have more blockages or more degradation, it's going to drop your performance. So you still have connectivity, you just won't get the same throughput you would have if you're really close to the site, for example. And that's what they're trying to show in this picture here, what we're showing, that it's kind of hard to see, but we've got some sites here, and you can see there's different levels of color. So near the site, maybe it's a lighter color, you've got a lot stronger signal, a lot stronger throughput level. And as you get further away from the site, it drops down. And so really coverage for these maps is measured in throughput. Once you get, when coverage is shown here, no longer depicted, it is white, meaning there's no coverage. It just means you can't deliver a certain level of throughput. It doesn't necessarily mean you won't have signal. It just means you're not getting whatever that threshold is. So if you set the threshold really high, this coverage map shrinks down, right? If you set the threshold really low, the coverage map grows. And that's just because that's how it's being depicted. So another way to look at it is think of it as how many bars you get on your phone, right? So if you're in one of these strong areas, you're going to have a lot of bars. If you have down on the fringes, maybe you only have 1, 2, 3 bars depending on where you set those thresholds. So very different in the way you see coverage and the way the system works. And you also see that too when we talk about user capacity and how that affects things. Like any LMR network, the type of device you use on the networks will affect coverage. So these are just some examples that were taken, old examples from the Harris County system, but they were showing coverage. So in this case, this was the coverage you could expect to receive if you were using a vehicular radio with an antenna mounted on the roof. And FirstNet is also looking at actually some higher powered vehicular radios to use on this network that aren't commonly used today in the marketplace, so that you get improved performance. Consequently, if you were to take those users driving around the same vehicles and they're using a USB modem plugged into their laptops mounted in the car, so worse performance of an antenna, you're inside a car, you've got some shielding, that's the type of performance they would expect to get. So knowing what types of devices your users are going to use and knowing how that affects coverage will also be important when talking this whole coverage topic with FirstNet. All right, so let's talk about our baseline a little bit. Again, this was not, if you don't want this, you don't have to accept it. This is simply a starting point for you to begin the discussion on coverage. So we broke it into the 4 categories. We do know that FirstNet is definitely kind of working in these categories. So I think the categories will hold true, but however you want to determine what you put in those categories is something obviously that will. That's the whole point of this workshop and what your work will be carrying forward. So in building coverage, we used that urban areas and urban clusters as a threshold. So where are there 1,000 people per square mile or more? That was our starting point for where you would potentially need in-building. Thinking, very dense population centers are typically where you have your big buildings and you need in-building coverage. Handheld or we say partial in-building because remember, you'll still get some in-building coverage from those sites, even if you're just trying to build out to that handheld level. And that's defined as coverage down to someone on the street. We said taking those census-designated places, so you still have your population centers, but if they fall below that 1,000 people per square mile threshold, and they're still within a census-designated place, that's what we defined as handheld coverage. So basically, you're still in the population center, you've just gotten outside of that really densely populated area. We also added in this, any census designated place with more than 500 people. We found, and you'll see some anomalies in census data, that as soon as U.S. Census designates a census designated place, it forever stays a census designated place, or a CDP, even if people move away from that CDP. So we kind of tried to screen those out by saying at least had to have 500 people in that CDP, otherwise it didn't get included. And then for vehicular modem coverage, basically this is this becomes now the threshold of where you have terrestrial coverage. So this is the build out of the network, really the fixed infrastructure network. And if we're targeting a vehicular level type device, we said let's look at 2 things. One is now let's look at kind of that rural versus non-rural separation. And we used 5 people per square mile, and that was actually a number that was represented by the PSAC actually, saying that here's a, actually Harlan McEwen previously in his role said that they were kind of using that target to define rural versus non-rural. So we said that sounds like a pretty good starting point. So 5 people per square mile, and then in addition to that, the major highway systems, knowing the importance of those in traversing. So for mobile or vehicular level coverage, we combine those 2 data layers and said, okay, so we take the highway system, 5 people per square mile, add to what we've already done, the combination of that becomes where you're looking at all terrestrial coverage. And then wherever you don't have that, that's where you would rely on those satellite or deployables for coverage. So let's take a look at what that looks like on the map now. So, in-building coverage, 1,000 people per square mile, urban areas, urban clusters. You can see the dark green on the map, and it's kind of hard to see in some of the areas up here, but you also get some concentrations there in some of the other cities. And these are, again, if you want to go into those county worksheets, it's the same information, it's just broken down to the county, so it's kind of a zoom-in type ability. The next was handheld or partial in-building. So this is, again, the outside those 1,000 people per square mile, but still within the census-designated place. So you can see that's depicted by the light green. So a lot more of these areas where you might want to have at least handheld or on-the-street type coverage. The next one then is the combination, remember, of 5 people per square mile and the highway system. So when you take those and combine them together, you can kind of see, in Arizona especially, since the population is very concentrated, you can definitely see where the highways are driving that, and then in some of the urban areas where you can see population, where the 5 people per square mile is driving that right around some of the population centers. So that's the resulting coverage objective, not the coverage map, based on that baseline that we put together as a starting point for you to discuss. The resulting white would be deployed with satellite or some type of deployables. So, knowing that population and highways is a limited data set with which to evaluate public safety requirements, and we know that you want to tailor this, we tried to put in additional information that you could use to take into consideration for how you want to determine coverage. So, bringing back in some of those other layers we looked at previously, tribal lands. So this is a good way, then you overlay tribal lands on top of this, and you say, well, there's a lot of tribal lands that aren't identified for any type of coverage. So do you want to, cover the whole tribal land, or look at what are the unique requirements within the tribal lands if it's not already covered by that baseline or whatever you've put together? This is a way you could do that and kind of have that discussion with the tribes. This is just showing now the initial boundaries and roads and kind of more layers layered on top of it. Agency data. So we've overlaid the agencies, and although it may not be critically important to know where every agency is with respect to coverage, because really it's their operational area that becomes more important, you can certainly kind of start to see where you have agencies identified, and if the agency is in the middle of an area where there's no coverage identified, then the probably operational area is in as well. So this is just showing all the agency data overlaid on top of it. Facilities. Now this gets really important back to your question about the corrections facilities. So we've identified from various sources where there are some critical facilities that we think would probably have significance or of importance to public safety. So prison areas, certainly, where's that prison that's out in the middle of the rural area where there's no coverage identified, but you need coverage and all the routes going to and from it need coverage. It's a perfect example where you want to make sure that those are captured, included in your coverage baseline, and what level of coverage do you need. EOCs, hospitals, PSAP, schools. Schools is a really good one. That comes up often about, the response within schools. Sometimes the use of high schools, for example, for staging or, secondary use for public safety. So that's a good one to see. Question?
Yeah, can I read about the information from?
Variety of sources. A lot of this information came from DHS, the HSIP data set, Homeland Security Infrastructure Protection Program. So
they query the state?
What's that?
Did they query the state now?
I don't know. I know they work to collect information with the states, but this is why, yeah, that's a perfect example. You would want to go through, and if you have existing data sets that you know that the state has gone through and scrubbed, then you would want to definitely use your data sets as we go with anything here. So.
Yeah, and as part of this process, Brian will be providing the data to us, and then we'll be validating it with each, as we get down to the more local level, that each agency and/or corrections and/or whatever will be validating that this data is accurate.
Right. Question online, question about population density versus relationship of coverage. It should be related to business needs, not necessarily population density. Yeah, so again, this is just where are the operational needs for public safety? Where would you need in-building coverage? You're absolutely right. It's driven by that need. And so how do you want to determine that need, whether it's jurisdictional areas? This was just, again, our attempt to kind of help start that discussion and get you thinking about how are you going to break down and determine where you need in-building coverage? Is it every place there's a building? And if that's the case, then how are you going to identify every place that there's a building? So, whatever data sets you want to use to leverage, that's exactly what this process is targeting for you to do. So facilities as an example, you can see them overlaid here on the map, and their coverage levels. And this really will become important when you start to zoom in and drill down to certain areas of interest in using that. Critical infrastructure, the same thing. So public venues, great example. You might have a public venue, a stadium or something, a shopping mall that might be in a remote area, but you still Grand Canyon. National Parks is a really good example, especially with the fluctuation of people you have in and out and responses. That is not going to show up on a population-driven map. So anything like that are things that you'd want to use to incorporate and tailor these maps exactly. So you take all that, put it on together, and the map starts to get pretty busy, but it's a good way just to really start to get a sense of what do we need to look at, how do we want to tailor this, how are we going to take this information and drive changes into what your coverage objectives are. Yeah.
I see a big gap on here, and that's our ports of entry. They're not identified along the southern border, and none of our ports of entry are they on the next map?
They are highlighted. Canadian and Mexican border crossing.
Border crossing.
Oh, they're on this one? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that is bigger.
It's a huge one, yeah.
You can only see like one little piece of them along the border. The little icon is like chopped in half.
So yeah, yeah, it gets cut at the state line. So.
Border crossings are only in the United States.
It's a great example, though. I mean, you'll know exactly once you look at this where you need coverage and start to provide input that we need whatever portable level coverage at that area or in-building coverage. And you can specify and provide that input so that gets rolled into your coverage objective. This is just a view where if you take that coverage objective and you kind of flip-flop it and you put it on top of all that information, almost to kind of mask out everything, you can kind of then start to see what still shows up from behind that. And that might be a good way when you're looking at some of the tools that once you've identified your coverage objectives, you overlay those on top, and what sticks out, what's still not being covered with your coverage objective. It's just a different way to view the data to kind of take a look at it. That's what this is doing.
Let me get this straight. You've removed all the points of interest, let's say, that have been covered?
Nope. All we've done is when you're working within GIS, you can determine which layers go on top.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So on the previous map, all this data was on top of the coverage objective, and on this map, all of it then goes behind. So it's a way to kind of mask out and look at what might be missing still. Good question. Any other questions? Just trying to show examples of how you can take this information and kind of reassess and evaluate. Federal land. So Arizona obviously has a lot of federal land, and the engagement with the federal agencies and how this would get incorporated into the coverage. Where do you have coverage on federal lands, or where is it lacking? Again, FirstNet will be working with federal entities, but certainly as it pertains to you and federal lands, this could be something you take a look at for consideration. We took examples of what we could find on existing LTE coverage with the thought that, this is where the commercial have claimed that they're building out their LTE, and this changes, I know, very, very quickly because the build-outs are expanding greatly. And it's also self-reported by the commercial providers, and it's also them defining what coverage is, and there might be different thresholds. But again, just if you're trying to get a sense of where you have commercial coverage maybe, some people kind of want to use that as a good sanity check or comparison point. It might be a good kind of data layer to take a look at. This is actually probably the same data that was put together from your old broadband mapping team, and this is the data that was provided for as part of that initiative. But this is the combination of all service providers, all levels of service aggregated into one map to take a look at. So then you start to see how does the commercial coverage line up to maybe where your coverage objectives are specified. So you can see up here in that part of the state, the northeast part of the state, that with our objectives, there's a lot of potential areas that could get covered that doesn't look like there's any existing commercial service up there. Or maybe this is the way you kind of say, there is no commercial service up here, so this might be a target for where we would want to build out the public safety network, so more robustly. So again, all this data can be used different ways. We're just showing it as examples. You guys can take this and move forward with it. So based on what we've seen there, what type of feedback would you have, if you want to have some of the dialogue immediately where you'd want to see in-building, or what some different ways you could prioritize how you'd want in-building coverage? Any thoughts on that? We already talked about the prisons and correctional facilities. That's a great example. No matter where they are, they always need to have in-building coverage.
One of the trunk system builders that build jurisdictions that build trunk systems have identified those areas for in-building mission critical voice, and they already have coverage maps identified different building types in those areas. So with major operators of those systems, we could start to get some coverage maps together.
Yeah, that's a great example. So any of the previous work done where they're trying to identify where in-building coverage is needed would be a really good one. Any other questions, thoughts on in-building? Different sources that might be a good starting point for you to use as a foundation for where you'd want in-building coverage? All right, how about handheld coverage? Just what would be a driving factor? Again, we kind of just use population density. We know that's maybe not necessarily the best case, but can you think of other ways where you'd want minimally to have some type of handheld coverage to a device, and what thresholds or what data sets you would use to help drive that determination?
Well, I think in the rural part of the state, one of the things I would look at is Forest Service and Park Service user estimates annually, because, well, for instance, the bulk of Apache County is 5 people per square mile less, but in the summertime, it's not uncommon for me to have 30,000 people in the forest. So or in the national parks, that's why forests as well. So.
Yeah, so that's a great point. So population density is based on static population where people live. It's not where they work or where they migrate to. So wherever you have people going in fluxes of population is a great one to identify on where you want coverage.
I'm thinking venues where it's foot traffic only, stadiums, in the city kind of areas that generally people are not driving, but high density.
High density, yeah. How about any big, we always use the example up in Nevada with Burning Man, where they're going out to the middle of the desert and there's a huge, gathering of people. Are there examples like that where you might probably want at least handheld coverage to that area, even though it might not be driven by those? All right, so vehicular level coverage, we talked about the major highways, roadways. A lot of feedback we get there. Sometimes there's secondary roads or evacuation routes or key roads that they might not be a major highway, but you still want to make sure they have some level of coverage, even if they are in a rural part of the state. Any thoughts or any suggestions on evacuation routes or any examples like that for coverage?
Well, it's more of our vision set that, for instance, in the middle country, we have rural officers that are outdoors, with vehicles all the time, and they actually have to transfer over to, sometimes to federal lands for hospital visits, and they're, on reservations, and we have to work through the issues of that. And then, if we unfortunately got a situation where we've got to go out and train somebody, we're going to be doing that jointly, in vehicles, with actual equipment.
Yes.
Does anybody address coverage for air access? So say you're doing SAR missions like search and rescue, or even in the city, because most of the towers are radiating down.
Right.
Rather than up.
Right. Great question. It's come up. I would definitely recommend that whatever operations you have that would require those types of communications that you want to operate on this network, that those get mentioned in the discussion and how they could potentially get covered. Do you know if today are they using commercial services to provide?
I know San Diego is.
Yeah.
Yeah, San Diego, they basic streamers were backed up to night SAR missions. Actually, one of our actually called.
Are they doing that on the commercial networks, or are they doing that on their own dedicated link?
It's on their own closed system, but it's just as easily being there for. Well, I shouldn't say just easily, it's like you said.
Exactly.
That's the point on the tower. Theirs is a closed microwave.
Yeah, they're pointing to the different mountaintop sites throughout the.
So
So that is, and there's been a couple there. I know the network that they've built out in Harris County, they kind of have a different network where if you get out at an elevation, or rather than using a satellite as backhaul, they're using microwave shots to key high points throughout an area. So that's basically what they're doing in San Diego as well.
and who knows, that may be the solution, in that you see a microwave shot into cave,
But definitely air operations would be a good one to include, because that's.
I know on San Diego, as they keep checking, they actually have it now where I can actually get the quarter update on any of the users to my iPad.
Yes, hospitals are included in the discussion as well. And that's a great one of, what level of coverage you need for hospitals in building because of the type of work that would go on delivering a patient. So that's a very good one. We got a comment online. It's kind of hard, I guess, for obviously the guys on the phone to hear some of the discussions from the discussion. Should we just hand out?
Yeah, why don't we hand out some microphones?
So one question that's brought up are lakes and rivers. So that's another good one. What type of response is done on some of the main lakes, and what those aren't going to show up obviously with population. So considerations like that when you're doing your coverage objectives of, again, kind of non-traditional areas you'd want coverage. What about just that rural population threshold? What do you think would be a good threshold or baseline to determine where it makes best sense to build out terrestrial coverage versus where you could potentially rely on satellite or some type of other deployable coverage? Do you think 5 people per square mile is a reasonable threshold? Do you think there's a better threshold for that?
I'm going to make a comment, and I'm pretty loud, so hopefully you can hear me. Don't tend to get my phone. My concern would be that when we talk about 5 people per square mile, that we take into consideration the snowbirds and the snowbird population, especially like over in La Paz County and down in Yuma, where we have a very large influx of snowbirds, which, 50% of the year, the residential population that's there 50% of the year doesn't take into consideration that it goes 4 to 5 times above that during the snowbird population. So that would be my concern,
Really good.
is to take into consideration that in
I've got family there myself. I know it very well. Yeah. So a great point of that not year-to-year population, but that transient or the population that will be the influx of.
And we see that also. I know you've got identified the venues over in Mojave County as far as along the river during the summer months with the summer population along that river. But it gets extremely large, and a lot of those would be camping type venues. So when we're talking about that, also covering those larger populations that boom during those spring break time frames.
Yep, that's a good one.
Jay, don't you want to mention the Renaissance Fair?
So another comment that was brought up in the chat was the far west valley and the nuclear plant around there, and probably even though it's in a rural area, and we talked a little bit about that with those kind of critical infrastructure, but identifying. And the question is, with that critical infrastructure, all those facilities, is it something where you want it for every single one, or is it on a case-by-case basis? I mean, those are other considerations that you're going to have to make on what coverage is it. Do you need in-building at some, but handheld is better at others? A lot of questions on where you need coverage and how you want to use these different factors to determine that. Any other thoughts on rural, just where you want the fringes of this network to be built out to?
Are there some border enforcement issues that need to be thought of, particularly on that last level? Are southern counties going to have high enforcement zones that they're going to want more than the standard coverage in?
And I think that's a very good consideration, and that's something that we should probably be meeting with sheriffs on along that, because depending upon where those routes of egress are coming in through, especially along that Oslo area, and there's some other ones that definitely have more coverage. And if you look at the population of law enforcement versus the population of law enforcement tells a lot, whether that law enforcement be federal or state or local or tribal, and you see a higher concentration of law enforcement along the border. So I think that has to play some factor into coverage areas as well, and where those ports of entry are, and then also the routes of egress, which are around those ports of entry and up through different routes.
So another way of saying it might be, it's not just the 5 people in that area, it's the 5 people from the state.
And I will tell you, it's exactly, and that's, if you walk into Nogales and if you look around, your population versus your law enforcement coverage is much different than what you see, up in Apache County or Navajo County. That per capita, law enforcement per capita is much different coverage.
That's a good point.
We did have another question online. With respect to coverage reliability, since systems or sites may not always be available due to maintenance or service issues, what is being planned to inform or request approval from end-user agencies on any changes in coverage or system configurations, or to inform them of temporary system impairment? This is important to know for when users need 24/7 coverage. So that's another great question. That's actually been asked several times, and we know there's been challenges on the commercial side where you don't always get that. Oh, by the way, we're taking down a site or two for service repair. So that will be one of those operational issues that will be the perfect type of thing in that operations section of the state plan we talked about. That during consultation, those types of realistic operational issues are important. You want to make sure that you get on the table that's discussed, and you know how that process will be worked out. I don't know how it's going to work out. I do know that that question has been asked, and it's very important to know that the users will have some type of input to when systems go down for maintenance, so that they're aware of it and can plan accordingly.
It's also in the NIPSC statement of requirements.
Yep. So good question. So for satellite deployables, is there a lot of satellite or deployable use in the state today? Is that successful, unsuccessful, highly used, not highly used? What's some feedback on this concept? Do you think it's a viable potential? Do you not think it is? What are some of the thoughts on satellite or deployables being used to provide a backup to terrestrial coverage?
Depends on the incident and the
time required on deploying that asset out there?
Yeah, if you add more emergency services or special events.
So highly dependent on deployment and how long it takes. So that maybe they're used for planned events, not necessarily in response. Is satellite used today? Is there a lot of users of satellite today in the state?
It would be more of a federal,
Yeah, that's
federal
right.
asset,
Yeah,
not
still
local.
So it sounds like anyone here in their agencies use satellite?
We have plenty of satellite, but it's really a sort of emergency response platform. It's the last resort.
Yeah.
Recovery. Expensive, painful,
Right.
So, well, that's kind of like when you're operational period, you have 12 hours, that kind of something.
Yeah.
That when we deploy out of the area, we don't have the infrastructure on the ground.
So really a last resort if there's no LMR coverage, you're resorting it for voice or data or both? Both? All right, any other comments, thoughts on coverage in general or anything we've talked about?
One of the things that we're hanging up on too is the in-building coverage. We really kind of glossed over the vehicular modem part of being able to connect a handheld device into the vehicular modem for connection to the system, because those kinds of equipment deployment has an impact on the way you could build the system.
Right, so a comment on there hasn't been a lot of discussions on if you take your handheld device and connect into the vehicular radio as kind of just like a vehicular repeater, and if that's going to be the preferred method for deployment, that drives how you'd want. Maybe you can specify more vehicular level coverage.
And that's also a cost reduction for the users out in the field, because now instead of having five devices that I carry and connect to the network, I have one vehicle where my device is connected to the network.
Right. Yeah, so that's a good example of, I know some of the devices that they're looking at are, been proposed. A vehicular level radio could allow additional devices to connect to it, not only via LTE, but also via Wi-Fi. So you can create a little Wi-Fi bubble or hotspot around the vehicle. All other devices, maybe they don't talk LTE, can talk back to that master connection into the network. So that's a good point. So that's probably going to be a good discussion with the users. If users are willing to, if that's how they want to operate, then you're right. That's good. A lot of inputs into how you drive vehicular versus portable level coverage. Another question online was, will each state be required to set up a 24/7 NOC to enable or disable users or devices, or will this be handled at a national level? So a couple of different components of that. Great questions. I mean, it's unknown yet. Certainly at the regional workshops that FirstNet did, there was a lot of discussion about these NOCs and setting up NOCs. They've kind of indicated that they're looking to set up probably regional NOCs, not necessarily on a state-by-state basis. And that's for their own kind of management of the network. But certainly there was a lot of indications that having the ability for states to incorporate NOC-like capabilities into their own, whether existing NOCs or EOCs or whatever you have, that goes back to that. One of the capabilities of the network they're talking about is that ability to kind of look in and monitor the health and status of the network. It doesn't necessarily mean that FirstNet's going to build out a NOC in every state. It just means they will build up their own NOCs, but you would also have that capability potentially to have NOC-like capabilities as well. As far as disabling users and control, that has been a big aspect of what's been referred to as local control and the provisioning and control and access of the network. It's known that if it's going to be controlled access for eligible users, that's virtually impossible to do at a national level. That has to be pushed down to the local entities who know who the eligible users are and can be on the network, and it can't be done at a national level. So that's yet to be seen again. Eligible users, how that will work, that's the local control topic of provisioning and access control. All right. Any other questions? No, keep moving on. So at the end of the day, this is kind of what FirstNet will be looking for in a deliverable back to you. So you've taken, once you've gone through and you've gotten stakeholder input and figured out where you need in building, what different data elements are driving all those things. You've combined this onto a map. You've broken it into these 4 categories. This type of deliverable would go back to FirstNet and help shape that initial preliminary design of what the coverage would look like. So when they come back and then you start refining that coverage map, you know, this is going to be the very start of that process. And so that hopefully makes sense as to why they want this early in the process. And it also, this will be kind of just, it drives the initial starting point. They'll have to look at, you know, the resource availability and what they can do and then begin that dialogue with you of where are some of the trade-offs. Can we go, if you want to, we can't, maybe, you know, if you can't deliver all the coverage that's being asked, do you trade off more in-building coverage for wider area coverage? Is it depending on how you're going to operate with vehicular, you know, can you do less portable coverage and expand your vehicular level coverage? Those types of discussions will go in, and that's why that design will be refined throughout the process. But this is what kicks it all off, where you tell the FirstNet what you're looking for from a coverage standpoint. Questions?
A couple quick questions, and maybe I'm skipping ahead of you, so I apologize if I am, but looking at the agency breakdowns, both by agency type and personnel number for the county-specific worksheet, and just looking at, for my own county, I can see that, you know, talk about the police departments, obviously the numbers that you guys are using are sworn personnel, and is that standard that you're going with? Because if you look at my agency, the number that you have for us, we're about 250 personnel short of what we actually have, and then additionally, it seems like we're missing some pretty key public safety disciplines like probation and parole, as well as wildland fire, which plays a huge role in the American Southwest. It fluctuates based off the fire seasons and not only the air assets, the ground assets. And I know that, you know, sometimes, oh, well, that's federally controlled. Not always, you know, so that's a question from a user standpoint that's concerning.
Yes, no, great questions, and that's, again, we just took data that we had available and made it and put it there so that you can look at it, and with the hope of maybe there's some agencies or some counts you didn't know, so this is the best guess, so you at least have some information to carry forward. As far as who are the eligible users, we just included police, fire, EMS in those tabs. We know that there's a lot more disciplines that are being targeted, and we can include that. The reason we didn't include them in those spreadsheets is really in that, or those county worksheets, all we have are the agency names. We don't have any more data on them. You can get, what we do have is we've taken all of our data that we have. It's available in CASM, one of the tools that we have. And so you can run a report out of that, and it'll tell you every agency that's in that database by discipline, which point of contact, number of personnel, broken down by sworn, total, broken down by full-time, part-time. However you want to break it down, you can do that. We know that FirstNet right now is trying to determine, you know, with more certainty who the eligible users are to have that discussion, because that will drive a lot of your outreach education and collecting that information. So that's something that they want to have, you know, a discussion around. I know at the initial consultation meeting with respect to users.
What about a hierarchy amongst users, and how's that determined? So if you have a massive multidisciplinary event that solicits a response from people even outside of your area, then are there user-based permissions as far as, because it doesn't matter how quality the network is that gets put together, there's always a potential that it could be overloaded, and if that's the case, then what's the hierarchy of user permissions, or however that's set up, to who trumps who?
Right, so great question. So the question on user priority and how that's going to be set up, and the difference between static priority and initial setup versus kind of dynamic priority, what you change on the fly. Those are a lot of discussions that will be taking place during this. By law, they have to. That is something that's going to be down the road, I think, when you start getting closer to. It'll be included in the consultation process, just not early on in the consultation process, because frankly, I don't know that there's been a lot of work and a lot of discussion, but I don't think there's been a lot of determinations made.
And, you know, as you mentioned earlier about personnel, you're right, the priority on, like, the community service officers needs to be lower than your police officers.
Right.
And that's where some of that ideally will get established in that.
Yeah, ideally, it'll be an NIMS ICS, that you declared an incident, everybody
question in the back? No, you're good, okay. So, yeah, good question to know. That's very important, but it'll be coming down the road, especially, you know, once you determine who those eligible users are. You need to know that first before you start talking prioritization. All right, so any questions? This is kind of wraps up the whole coverage discussion. Do you guys have a good understanding of kind of what the next steps or what the objectives are for accomplishing this and getting how you're going to get to this kind of end goal of something that you would deliver to FirstNet? Is there any questions on that? Pretty clear? Pretty easy, right? All right, good deal. One other comment online before we move on. I also had an understanding that critical municipal workers would be included. So again, yeah, that's absolutely, you know, the law specified who the eligible users were, and it just says, basically, it refers to a couple of different references. And those references will tell you that anyone providing public safety services, right? So it's not a specific public safety agency. It's the act of providing public safety services. So I don't think anyone would deny there's a lot of people that can be argued that are providing those types of services. I think really one of the big questions becomes, do they have access to the network only when they're providing those services, or do they have access to the network at any time so long as they can, or they have the ability to provide those services? That becomes one of the big distinctions, because that's going to be really hard to then govern and control user access based on when they're providing those services. So that's why there's a lot of questions around user eligibility and who those users will be, and that will be a good discussion topic, and that will have to come out early in that consultation because it's going to drive a lot of things we do going forward. All right, so jumping into users now. So we talked coverage and the importance of that. Now we're going to talk users and how that drives capacity and why that's important for the design of a network. Because those two things, as we said, go into the design of the network overall. So let's talk a little bit about how LTE works and how it differs from LMR. So we know today in an LMR system you have N number of channels at a site. They're fixed bandwidth. You have a voice conversation on that channel. Multiple people can participate on that voice channel in a group type communication. But if you want to have a different conversation, you need a different channel. And you can support at a site, as long as there's the channels are available, they're not in use, you can support the amount of conversations that there are channels for that site. For public safety and LTE, it's a lot different because this spectrum is split up, as you know. That whole 20 megahertz of spectrum, 10 by 10, is available at every site. So which means that, where those sites have overlap and there's some interference between them, but that whole bandwidth is available. And then the system determines who has access and how much access they have on a dynamic basis. So someone comes in, there's a request to start streaming video, the spectrum's available, the resources are available. They get assigned the amount of resources that they need to perform that request. And so in this case, the streaming video might be using a bigger piece of the pie, a bigger pipe. They can do that. Now you might get other users coming in with different requirements, different requests, and they might be using different amounts of the spectrum, but as long as there's available spectrum, available resources, they can do that. It can be supported. Now just like any technology and there's always limitations, right? So if you have too many users trying to request too many things, then it's not going to fit. There's not enough resources in that pipe. So something's going to have to either not be serviced. There's different ways you can control when you start hitting that saturation point, whether it's by application, by user, many different ways. And that's where this whole prioritization becomes very important, because it's not necessarily by user. It could be by service or application as well. A different way to look at it. So on LMR side, everything's pre-configured. You've got overlapping coverage from a site, so all those channels pretty much provide the same level of coverage, right? So if a user comes in, they need access. They're within the coverage footprint. They can talk to each other. As more users come in, it doesn't affect those previous users. They can have their conversation right on top of each other. So really, coverage and capacity are almost independent with LMR. Take on the counter side then an LTE system, and let's look at like I said, all the sites use the same frequencies. In fact, they're actually broken into sectors. So You may have heard the sector. They usually typically have 3 sectors per site. That 10 megahertz or 20 megahertz, the 10 by 10, is used in each one of those sectors. It's reuse, frequency reuse. Not only in each one of those sectors, but then all the overlapping sites that would be around this. So a lot of spectrum reuse. And that's why, is that enough spectrum? You get a lot of questions. Is there enough spectrum for public safety use? Well, the way you control that is you just build more sites and shrink that coverage footprint and reuse more sites, because it's all a frequency reuse at that point. So if you want to add more capacity to the network, you shrink down that coverage footprint so you're servicing fewer users per site. So let's take a look at kind of how that works. So you have a user, they come in, they're maybe really close to the site, they make a request, and say if they're the only user in that sector and they want to do, stream some huge file or download something, in theory, they could access the entire spectrum. They're in the best area for signal. That's the maximum throughput opportunity for that user in that sector. Now, will that ever happen? Probably not. Would it happen? I know sometimes you might not even ever want to be able to have one user take up that whole spectrum. But in theory, that's how it would work, all right? So now if they're moving around within that sector and they move further away where they have poorer performance, so the throughput degrades, they're still using the same amount of spectrum, right? It's not like here where it's fixed channel, fixed amount of spectrum no matter where you're at within the coverage footprint. It's all the same. Here it changes. It's very dynamic. So if you have another user that comes on, now maybe they're putting the request in as well. So now that spectrum gets split up. So now you service one user with part of the spectrum, you service a different user with a different part of the spectrum. And as more users come in, they start slicing out and taking different pieces of that spectrum, to the point where if you have a lot of users in one area, you can only split up those resources so many times before you just aren't servicing people with the amount they need. So that's when prioritization becomes really important. And this is really important too, because remember when I mentioned coverage is measured by throughput levels, right? So we determine where this line is drawn on the outside of coverage based on throughput and how much throughput can be serviced by a site. But that's completely dependent on the number of users you have on it. Because if you have too many users and they start to split this up really tight, you can't provide the amount of throughput that's required to kind of determine that they have coverage or not. So the number of users is highly dependent on what services can be provided reliably and how much throughput can be provided reliably. That was a question that was brought up, I think, earlier before, also online, the importance of users and knowing the number of users you'll have and where they operate will drive how much throughput could be delivered to them. And that's why if you get to a really densely populated area, they won't put those towers up really high because they don't want too many users on any one site or one sector. And as I mentioned, so in a sector that frequency is being used, you can have other users participate on a different sector, reusing the same spectrum, and not necessarily impacting what these users are doing here, except for the standpoint if you get a lot of users in an area, it creates more interference, and it can actually kind of reduce the coverage footprint of that cell. So that, depending on how many users you have in an area, that coverage footprint might kind of change a little bit. So that becomes important too from modeling. I mean, there's so many dynamics that when you look at coverage, it's really difficult to kind of estimate. So, question?
Is this capacity scale to average use or scale to peak use, like on Boston Marathon?
So when they do their modeling, and that will be a good question, they typically do an incident type use. So it's not day-to-day use. Typically, if they design for day-to-day use, the traffic usage is far lower, and that would not be the best way to design. You also can't design to worst case scenario, because one user could potentially, in the worst case scenario, could be using a big portion of the spectrum, and then you'd have to be building, so many sites to accommodate that. So you have to kind of find that middle ground. So I know with some of the preliminary modeling that's been done, they actually used the Minnesota bridge collapse as an example and built up a traffic profile that said the average user would be doing these 4 or 5 things. And if we had that many number of users, then how many sites would we need to accommodate that type of incident?
If you want to look at worst case, example, potentially on the data, the secret why they were just testing on sending some of their biological sample data back over the net, and that was a huge chunk they almost dropped the commercial.
Yeah, so, and this is, this is if every user was constantly using the spectrum, but typically, in communications, these are the first type of information, you're using something, off you go. So it's very dynamic in the way this gets allocated, but when you're trying to just do modeling and figuring out where you need coverage and how you can support a network from a capacity standpoint, this is kind of how it works and what this is modeling.
So we're using data today, and we have a commercial provider, we're able to from that provider how much bandwidth we're using per month, and then couple that with GIS data, that kind of thing. Is that
absolutely be great data, because that would help determine your user base is using this type of data. And I mean, in fact, they've been asking for that for FirstNet, and some of the engineering team has been asking for that type of information for quite some time. So not only your day-to-day use and the aggregated use, that's helpful, but also if there's some type of event, if you can somehow quantify that event and then determine how much data and what type of data was being used, great for modeling, so that you know that, hey, this network was designed to support this type of incident, and this is, those are the factors we use in trying to determine it can support that. Without that, it's all guessing. I mean, again, this is all estimations, right? It's all modeling, but it's just a way to try to, so you just understand what premises are behind when they're designing the coverage of this network, and knowing that they're going to use likely a lot more stringent design requirements than you have on the commercial side. All right, any other questions on this? So, as I said, modeling is extremely difficult to do. This is a good example. This is an old chart from the actual Bay Area, the Bayrick system. And it's a little difficult to see on the map, but what we're trying to show here is that this is the kind of the basic coverage for the network that they were proposing. I forget how many sites it was for this exact proposal, but what we're trying to tell is that they had to go in and look at the number of users they had. And so you can see in the San Francisco area, in the Oakland area, the blue dots, the sites are almost right on top of each other. And that's because that design is for capacity. They're not trying to put up a high site and boom coverage, because they'd have, thousands of users trying to access one site and splitting up those resources really slim. So sites very close together to support users, but you get on the fringes out here, and they have sites that are much more spread out, because the user volume is much lower. So you can design more for coverage out there. Higher sites, you've got lower users on it. And that's a good indication right here in just this one regional design, how different it is and what different factors drive the design. So that's why it's really important to know where your users are and how many you have, because it drives which type of design it is. So this is taking some of that data we had collected, just as an example, to try to show, well, if you start putting this in a map and trying to figure out, what is maybe a crude operational or jurisdictional area, and then taking those users and distributing them out across there, you start to see now this becomes that, rather than population density, it becomes the public safety density. And the more granular you can get with determining where those users are, where they operate, and how many you have in these areas, the better that information can be fed into to your inputs to FirstNet on where users are, how many you have, and where they operate. So we just took that, broke it down. Sheriff, law enforcement, local police, firefighters, both volunteering career, just trying to show maybe local city jurisdictions. This is a roll-up of, so the question was raised on some of the data that we had before of public safety agencies and the personnel count. So in the back for the county worksheets, we included police, fire, EMS, because we had some numbers here for number of personnel and number of agencies. We know it's not complete. We know you have more data. But ultimately, at the end of the day, this number of devices is the most critical element, because that's what you pay for. That's really what's used in the network. It's not necessarily users. It's the number of devices. So trying to figure out how many agencies, how many users, and then how many devices they have, and what's that ratio of user per device will be important and useful information, because that's the type of thing that they'll use for the modeling. And so we figured it's probably relatively easy, or not easy, but if you have a good chance of collecting agency count information, the number of personnel, number of devices, there's different ways you can try to gather that information, and then maybe you just kind of extrapolate from that. That if you get a sampling of agencies in these different disciplines on how many devices they have per person, you can kind of make estimations on that, because that's, like I said, at the end of the day, what's going to determine the number of users on the network. And so these are all, we actually worked with FirstNet a while back, and kind of this was, they've given in different presentations trying to estimate the number of users and the types of users. This is a chart that they put together, so you can kind of see the different discipline types that they're locating, potentially targeting, and how they're broken down. So the question that was raised before, yes, they are looking at all these, knowing that the eligible user discussion stuff to take place, but also recognizing that just to support a sustainable business model, you're going to need a lot of users, and so who might be the potential users to operate on the network? So, questions on it? Yes. Yes, yeah, and that's because this is just a roll up, and so if you actually look, all this data is available in CASM. If you were to do a very detailed printout, you'll see that some agencies just don't have, some agencies obviously aren't included, and then others just don't have personnel counts. So. Okay. Oh, right. Yeah, I got you. Good comment. Question, yes.
I don't see any information in here on federal users or anything like that. Is that going to be, we have a huge federal contingent along the border, and in other areas of the state, that should be something that we're considering as we go through this.
Absolutely, and so what FirstNet is trying to target is going to those headquarter agencies for those different federal users, and trying to work down through those organizations to gather that information, so that you don't have to worry about gathering it. But in that state plan, they might show you that here's what was gathered from you in the state and local side, and then here's what all the additional federal users and some of their requirements overlaid on top of it. So you see what the collective state plan vision looks like.
Just part of it, Forest Service, part of the carrier, ELM, and all of you guys here. And yeah, they're working. Good question.
Michael.
And from our perspective, will be anybody you work with, have MOUs with or whatever, you need to tell us, and we'll put them in from our perspective to make sure that we get the validation both at the central, AA level and at the local level.
Right. Yeah, and any type of joint operations you have where you know what the operational need is, there should be overlap there as well. Question online was, is anyone expecting a uniform cost model per user per device? Not that I'm aware of. I think this is really, I mentioned this per device number is really just an attempt to try to identify, to help with the cost and business modeling, right? To know that there's been a lot of assumptions made on the number of people that are in these different agencies, and you have to extrapolate that to the number of devices. That could vary widely. Is it one device per user? Are there a lot of shared devices? Do some people have maybe more than one device per user? Is it a 2-to-1, 1-to-3 ratio? So knowing what those per devices are, and we already know in some data that we've seen that it varies widely based on discipline. Career firefighters aren't getting a lot of, volunteer firefighters aren't getting a lot of devices provided to them right by their agency. So their agency per device for volunteers is going to be a lot different than maybe on the career side. So knowing that ratio by discipline, I think, will be important. All right, so one of the things that we put together to try to help gather some of that information is one of our tools called the Mobile Data Survey Tool. It's really targeted at identifying the current use of what people have today in the way of mobile data. What providers are they using? What types of devices are they using? What type of fees are they paying per device, their monthly fees? And that would help kind of populate that chart we looked at before this information. You're certainly not going to get that from every agency. We just know that not every agency is going to fill out that type of information. But what it could do is you might have ways you can get this, the number of personnel, the number of agencies, and from some of those results, you start to get a sense of what people are typically paying, how many devices you have per user, and then maybe you estimate, based on the data you get, the sampling you get from that survey, you can start to estimate some of these other numbers. So that tool is activated already for Arizona based on some discussions we had. It's found here on the website. Happily at some other time we could go through and show you some of the key things of how it works and the data that's collected. These are the main categories of information or questions that are asked in that survey. So there's basic agency info, who's taken the survey on behalf of their agency, discipline type, location, contact info. As I mentioned, what type of commercial systems are in use today, who's the provider, what are the costs, devices, the contract types that they have, what type of private systems are used today for data, what have been some of the issues or barriers to and performance to wireless services today? What is it? Are they coverage limited? Are they? Is it just not? It's too costly. That it's not reliable enough. Those types of questions. Just awareness overall of NPSBN. Have they heard of this? Do they know about FirstNet, the nationwide public safety broadband network? Might help target some of your outreach and education areas. And then also just getting an estimate of land mobile radio and what their counts are there for comparison. With maybe down the road, the end goal of, if you start to recover some of those users. So from just aggregating some of the survey materials that have been done before, this is a breakdown of the different disciplines that have participated. The responses are kind of interesting in some areas. So for example, this shows that 58% of the users surveyed today are using commercial service. Some are using private data service, and then another 25% are using both. But in total, 89% of the users that were surveyed or agencies surveyed were using some type of wireless data system today. And granted, that might be more of the bigger agencies responding and not maybe some of the smaller agencies, so it might be a little skewed, but there is a lot of mobile data use today. When we first did this, we kind of heard that, not everyone could afford it, and maybe, not everyone's using wireless service or wireless data. Maybe it was a 50-50, but this goes to show that maybe it's a little bit more than that. And when you have this data, this is just a roll-up. So if you end up using the survey tool, you have all the data. You can break this down however you want. If you want to look at small agencies versus large agencies, if you want to look at however you want to determine rural versus non-rural, you can do that. So we just kind of grouped in large buckets the average cost per, what's your monthly device cost, so for data services. So you can see that the kind of the $20 to $50 range is where most of them fell. You'll get some outliers out here that maybe that they paid that much, maybe they just misunderstood the question. But knowing kind of what people are paying today will help that business modeling, that if people are used to paying, $35, $40 a month and they're getting unlimited data or whatever the plans may be, that if, that will help FirstNet so they can have, strategize what good cost models or plans would be to appeal to the state users. In this survey, the device, I was just talking about that device per user ratio was actually a lot smaller than a lot of us thought. There's been some questions on, well, what did they really answer as a device on some of the earlier versions of the survey, but all responders, this shows that it's basically one device for every 3 users. So that's why you need to really know that device ratio, not necessarily users, because if you just say, oh, I've got, potentially 1 million users, and you translate that to 1 million devices, that's not necessarily the case. So knowing that device per user ratio and how it differs by discipline will be important. Personal device. This is a really big one that there's a lot of use of personal devices on networks today. And are they getting any type of compensation? Is it allowable? How will that work with FirstNet? So that's a question that's asked that could be, you can look for from your agency. There's a question in the survey about applications. So asking not only what applications are in use today, but what are some of the most desired applications? To see kind of where the delta is. So you can see obviously a lot of the applications in use today, not too surprisingly, but and also fairly low bandwidth applications. A lot of the desired applications going forward, there are some higher bandwidth required applications that are being asked for by the surveyed agencies. cost is a factor. This is, is tough to tell really because it's hard to determine, what service or what value you're getting for cost. But it just goes to show that a lot of people already have said, it's worked into their budget. They just can't pay a lot more than what they have today for their service. So that was kind of just a snapshot of some examples of data that can be extracted from the mobile data survey tool if it's something that you want to incorporate or use in your outreach requirements. That's kind of the summary of it. So we talked, about the tools and how that can be leveraged, some of the agency data in CASM and capturing some of that information, mobile data survey tool. Did a lot of background, and then we hit the two topics of coverage and users and data, and hopefully you understand a little bit better why that's important aspects and how that will affect the design of the network. So that is all we have for our presentation. Are there any more questions or feedback from this? I'm standing between you and lunch, right?
I was going to say.
All right.
Thank you.
With that, is this helpful to this?
Yes. Excellent.
Good.
Great information. Thank you very much.
All right, very good.
Thank you.
Appreciate the time.
All right.
Thanks for coming, everyone.